In the grim darkness of the far future, there exists a brotherhood born in shadow, and their name is the Raven Guard, also known as the 19th of the Emperor's original legions, and their tale is not one of merely surviving, but of sacrifice, secrecy, and scars that run deeper than mere flesh. Their Primarch, the legendary Corvus Corax, was discovered upon Lycrus, a bleak moon that once orbited the industrial hive world of Kavahara. When the Emperor reclaimed him, the moon would be summarily renamed to Deliverance, a title heavy with irony, for though it was freed from oppression, Deliverance would forever be haunted by the weight of unending tragedy. The Raven Guard became masters of guerrilla warfare, with tactics that were a blend of surgical precision and silent devastation. They were to be the unseen hand of the Emperor's wrath, slipping behind the enemy's lines, striking with calculated violence and vanishing before retaliation could come. But their story darkened with the outbreak of the Horus Heresy, a civil war that shattered the Imperium and left the Raven Guard devastated, as their survival was owed only to desperate measures and no small amount of determination. Yet even victory would bring them no peace, as in the centuries that followed the Horus Heresy, a degradation of their legion's gene seed began to surface. Slow was the unraveling of what made them superhuman, as certain organs vital to the physiology of a space marine began to fail. The mucranoid and the Belcher's gland ceased to function entirely, while the melchromatic organ mutated, bleaching their skin a deathly white and turning their hair and eyes black as night. The cause of this is highly debated, but many believe it traces back to Corvus Corax himself and his tragic attempt to accelerate the creation of new Astartes after the Isstvan V atrocity. His experiments, which would be tainted by the Alpha Legion, produced horrors that could never be undone. And now, by M32, this genetic decay deepened to a point that it was nigh irreversible, as the Raven Guard's gene seed degradation grew more severe, to the point that some organs were rejected entirely. To sustain their chapter, they turned once more to the gene stock of Terra, and though this reliance slowed recruitment and stretched their resources insanely thin, they still fought on, silent and unyielding, and then there would come the Sable Brand. From the Legion's earliest days, a shadow of madness haunted particular sons of Corax, a cold, all-consuming battle fury, paired with a haunting delusion, the inability to distinguish the whispers of the dead from the voices of the living, a veritable schizophrenic episode. Their eyes would turn completely black, as their pupil would cover the entirety of their sclera, as though the darkness within the Raven Guard had surfaced for all to see. Some scholars claim that even Corax himself bore this affliction, and during the Great Crusade, those so afflicted were formed into a unit known as the Shadow Killers, used sparingly and with grim purpose, often being left to die on the battlefield after their deed was done. But after the near extinction at Isstvan V, such expendable deployment was no longer possible. And so, not only were the living Space Marines reintegrated back into the chapter, but their gene seed, which was likely heavily mutated and damaged due to the defect, was used and propagated throughout the entirety of the bloodline. In response, Corax sought control through discipline and doctrine. He forged the trifold path of shadow, a meditative code meant to restrain the madness of the Sable Brand. And while it lessened the frequency of outbreaks, it could not eliminate them entirely. Those who succumb would not die in battle, not anymore. They were too valuable, but rather they would be confined within the Ravenspire, the chapter's very own fortress monastery, where apothecaries would work in secrecy and study in a manner almost verbatim like the Blood Angels, with desire to cure their cursed gene seed. To this day, these experiments remain largely shrouded in both secrecy and silence, as the Masters of Shadow would have none outside the chapter know of it. Whether it be mercy, duty, or desperation that drives them, none can say. But one truth endures: the Raven Guard, even in the light of victory, will never exit the shadow of Corax. In the centuries following their near extinction at Isstvan V, the Raven Guard would refine how war itself was fought, turning it into an art form of undeniable precision and unknown deception, unlike their more zealous kin such as the Blood Angels, who favor glorious charges and full frontal assaults, along with glorious melee combat, the sons of Corvus Corax embrace more cold and calculated dimensions of warfare. They do not seek to overwhelm, they seek to unmake. Their approach to battle is rooted in striking where the enemy is weakest, with lightning assaults on vital positions, executed with surgical efficiency. They favor no grandiose displays, no glorious charges, completely ignoring the ABCs of combat, but rather only results, as the Raven Guard view war as a tool of liberation and annihilation in equal measure. Scouts are indispensable in their operation, acting as the Legion's unseen eyes, identifying enemy concentrations, rally points, and suitable landing zones for rapid, undetected descents. Once these targets are marked, vanguard formations descend from the skies, cutting the heart from their enemies before they even realize the battle has begun. Assault squads are often seen at the forefront of such engagements, equipped with jump packs to strike swiftly and disengage before retaliation is even possible. These strike forces sow confusion amongst the enemy's ranks, hitting fast and fading into the void, as tactical squads in turn deploy via Thunderhawks and drop pods, reinforcing the assault with disciplined volleys of sustained fire before vanishing back into the shadows of their own making. Commanders of the Raven Guard often favor using lightning claws, weapons that embody Corax's version of speed and precision. Their command cadres mirror this aesthetic, as they all wear black armor whose claws flash like streaks of lightning, descending upon their foes with a terrifying grace. But beyond these tactics and weaponry lies a philosophy that binds them together, the trifold path of shadow. Conceived by Corax himself, the path is represented by a three-bladed symbol. Sometimes it is in the shape of a trident, other times it is denoted by a triple tined claw, as each blade represents a singular principle: ambush, stealth, and vigilance. Corax taught that mastery of one of these ensured the possibility of victory. Mastery of two made their triumph likely, but command of all three rendered the enemy's defeat inevitable. This doctrine shapes the chapter's very structure, as companies 3 through 5 each specialize in one of these three paths, serving as both a training ground and instruments of war. Only those who master their path may ascend to the second company, a rank reserved for those closest to Corax's ideals. Many never reach it, as countless battle brothers live and die within their specialized companies, unmatched in their own discipline, yet forever chasing the impossible balance of all three. The chapter's warcraft extends beyond mere philosophy. It defines their arsenal, as the Raven Guard rarely field heavy tanks or land raiders, heavily favoring their resilience on stealth, meaning such machines are functionally a hindrance rather than an asset. Instead, they favor land speeders and gunships, platforms that complement their mobility and precision strikes, while maintaining an air of stealth. Their independence too sets them apart, as Raven Guard captains are allowed to operate with a remarkable amount of autonomy, commanding their companies as self-contained strike forces. It is rare for an entire chapter to ever take the field at once, even rarer than many of the other chapters descended from legions than any of the other chapters. They are more often to be found lending their aid across the galaxy, often without awaiting orders or sanctions from their chapter master. Some Imperial commanders have viewed this independence as an instability, yet others recognize it as a testament to their discipline and a trust forged in the proving grounds of their shadowed warfare. And yet, even with such control lies an awareness of fragility, as every member of the chapter understands that the chapter's very own gene seed is degrading. As it stands, the ever-present specter of the Sable brand ensures that apothecaries are needed to accompany any deployment. Over time, this necessity has led the Raven Guard into maintaining more apothecaries and helix adepts than nearly any other chapter in the Imperium. They are a brotherhood defined not by glory, but by purpose, silent predators who fight unseen wars for a dying Imperium. In every campaign, their methods whisper a truth learned long ago on Deliverance, that in the dark one must either become a shadow or be consumed by it. Through the long and haunted history of the Raven Guard, few tales inspire such unease amongst Imperial scholars as that of the Shadow Master, known in the ancient tongue of Deliverance as Mordethian. Their existence was a secret buried so deeply within the Legion's ranks that even their own brothers who fought beside them, would never know who or what they truly were. More Deathian emerged during the Great Crusade, as their origins were tied to a genetic quirk found in certain sons of Deliverance. These Astartes carried with them a spark of the Primarch's own strange gift, the ability to shadow walk, to blur and vanish from sight as if the light itself refused to touch them. This was no artificial enhancement, but rather a mutation born of Corax's bloodline, expressed only in the rare few. Yet, to the wider Legion, these warriors did not exist. Officially, they would be referred to as test subjects in a project involving thermal technology, a field so volatile and so obscure that few dared question its purpose. Only Corvus Corax himself and a handful of trusted apothecaries knew the truth, that this secret cadre operated beyond the sight of the Imperium, and even beyond the awareness of their own brothers. They were assassins, saboteurs, veritable phantoms of war, deployed where silence and precision outweighed brute strength. Shadowmasters spoke in stock argot, a code of gestures and low-frequency murmurs incomprehensible to outsiders. Working alongside the Greater Legion, they executed flanking strikes, disrupted enemy communications, and dismantled war machines before a single shot could be fired. Records from the campaign on Constantic II detailed how they ambushed and annihilated entire columns of rogue Skitarii, crippling a rebel mechanicum force before it could even bring its weapons to bear. Few ever saw them in action. Fewer still survived to experience it. To witness a Shadowmaster at work was to see the art of war stripped of sound and mercy and replaced by a silence that could suffocate a soul. In the aftermath of the heresy, as the Imperium reeled from its wounds, the principles behind this coven of covert operators endured, evolving into what would become known as the Mortit Protocol. The Mortit Protocol was a doctrine of infiltration and subversion, a method by which individual Raven Guards were dropped behind enemy lines for extended periods of time, tasked not with survival but with the cultivation of a rebellion. They would train local resistance cells, rally loyalists, and ignite insurgents to undermine hostile regimes from within. In time, these fires of insurrection would grow until the Raven Guard's arrival became less of an invasion and more of an execution of an inevitability. Even now, the legacy of the Shadow Masters lingers within the chapter, a whisper of a dark method passed from master to apprentice beneath an oath-bound silence of deliverance. They are proof that the sons of Korax see victory not born of glory, but rather of patience, precision, and the art of vanishing before the dust has even settled. If the Raven Guard are defined by war fought in silence, then their culture is shaped by that very same silence, a reflection of the Primarch's somber heart. Within the wider Imperium, they are regarded as distant. Their manner is grim and withdrawn, as their preference for secrecy has earned them few allies amongst their brother chapters. Yet for all their austerity, the Sons of Deliverance have never forgotten their origins as liberators of the enslaved. Their bond with mortal men, especially those from their homeworld, remains one of mutual respect, forged in the fires of rebellion and maintained through the quiet reverence of their shared purpose. Amongst their traditions, few are as storied as the Contest of Shadows, a test of subtlety and endurance known only to the initiated. But deeper still lies the rituals that shape their very soul, and that of the chapter. The Rite of Shadows are amongst their oldest customs, a ceremony carried out in absolute silence, using a specialized form of sign language known as Corspeak in order to ask and answer questions. The rites teach that the shadow holds both truth and deception. To master one, you must discern the other. Through this purpose, an Astartes learns not only to see his enemies clearly, but also his brothers and himself. Those who complete the ritual earn the honorific of Shadow. The title itself grants no rank, no privilege, only respect. For within the Raven Guard, respect is earned through understanding what cannot be spoken. Another tradition, older still, is known as Corvia. Every initiate at some point during their training or as part of a meditative quest, must hunt one of the small black ravens native to the forest of Kadavar. The challenge itself is immense, as to catch one of these wary birds barehanded and to still its fluttering heart, all the while preserving their incredibly fragile skull as a totem. These corvida hang from a warrior's belt by fine, almost silvered chains, each skull a symbol of a personal honor and resolve, being displayed fully for the chapter. And when a battle brother falls, his surviving comrades must recover his corvia and carry it into war, his memory and spirit now bound to theirs via this small totem, that is, until it can be returned to deliverance and buried in the soil of their home. Even in death, the Raven Guard embrace a form of humanity. When possible, a fallen warrior's body is to be stripped of armor and insignia, his gene seed reclaimed for the chapter's future, but his remains must be left upon the battlefield, buried and protected, as an offering to the carrion birds who will circle above. To the Raven Guard, this is not a desecration, but rather returning to the cycle of shadow and sky, from which all things come. Their mastery of concealment extends beyond the spiritual. One of their most elusive disciplines is known as wraith slipping, a hybrid of mental focus and physical technique that allows a warrior to blend into his surroundings, even while clad in the heaviest of bulky power armor. It is no psychic feat, but rather a collection of hard-learned movements, breath control, and environmental awareness, all culminating in the ability to vanish in plain sight in a way that endures from the eons before Corax himself vanished. Supporting these silent arts is the language of Crowspeak, taught to every Raven Guard from the moment they don the armor. On the battlefield, Crowspeak replaces the need for speech or vox signals, allowing warriors to move and coordinate without revealing their position. Some gestures are tactical, others are deeply symbolic. Phrases like Crowfane, Beast of Feathers, and Empathy Chime, along with a solemn murder call, which is a sign of demanding vengeance for a fallen hero, all speak to the quiet poetry of their stoic exterior. Amongst all the chapter's companies, none employ Crowspeak with a greater mastery than the second, whose shadow captains are required to wield it with absolute precision. Even their organization reflects Corax's vision of autonomy and adaptability. During the Great Crusade, the Legion itself followed the imperial model of chapters, battalions, companies, and squads, though Corax favored granting independent command to lower officers. This flexibility was actually a legacy of the Terran recruits from the Xeric tribes, and allowed the Raven Guard commanders to act swiftly without waiting for further orders, a principle that not only saved what little they could during the atrocities at Isstvan V, but endures to this day. When Corax reconstructed his legion, he commissioned new technologies from Mars, vehicles designed not for glory and not for survivability, but rather stealth. The Whisper Cutter was an open-topped atmospheric flyer which could be deployed to carry 10 Space Marines into a war zone without sound, leaving no trace of its descent, and then other craft would follow. Stealth-optimized Shadowhawk, Thunderhawk variants, and the Darkwing Storm Eagle, each tailored to the Legion's methods of covert warfare. After the Dropsite Massacre, when the Legion was shattered almost beyond recognition, Corax reorganized what remained. He divided the surviving warriors into new designations, reflecting their roles. Tactical companies became Talons, assault companies became Falcons, and their aerial vehicle elements would be further referred to as Hawk. Later, the arrival of genetically enhanced Astartes, known as the Raptors, would expand its structure further, and would be a final legacy of Corax's desperate attempt to rebuild what had been lost and fight back the darkness that was encroaching upon them. Each of these traditions, from the rites of shadow to the carrying of the Corvida, speak the same manner of truth. The Raven Guard's greatest strength lies not in their numbers, nor in their military might, but rather in discipline, memory, and silence. In a galaxy defined by endless war, there remains a whisper between heartbeat and an unseen hand of vengeance and deliverance alike. These are the Raven Guard. In the long and storied records of the Imperium's history, few tales invoke the same reverence as that of the Raven Guard. Once known as the 19th Legion, they were one of the Emperor's first and finest creations, born from Terra itself and molded in the fires of the Unification War. Their emblem, a black raven, was no idle choice. Across countless human cultures, it had always been a harbinger of fate and a silent messenger of death. It was an omen that would come to embody the very legion that had adopted it. When the Great Crusade was called, the Raven Guard answered, not with roaring banners or a thunderous charge, but rather with the quiet certainty of hunters who struck only once and without mercy. Even before the discovery of their gene father, the warriors of the 19th Legion had mastered the art of patience, precision, and ambush. They learned to wait in silence, unseen, right until the moment that it was time to strike, an approach that would soon become legend. Their destiny changed when they were reunited with their Primarch, Corvus Corax, the Deliverer, the Raven Lord. His presence transformed the Legion. Under his pale hand, warfare became poetry, swift, silent, and surgical. His warriors became masters of infiltration and sabotage, living embodiments of the shadows they so revered. Their doctrine of stealth and mobility would become a boon to intelligence gathering and the cornerstone of their campaign strategy. And under Corax, the 19th carved their name into the stars and the Great Crusade. Yet history remembers that even the most disciplined of hunters can fall victim to betrayal. On the blackened sands of Isstvan V, during the infamous Dropsite Massacre, the Raven Guard were nearly annihilated to a man. Betrayed by their own brothers, the Legion shattered, its strength broken, and its faith tested. But though they were reduced to almost ash, they would not fade. From the ruins of Isstvan, Corax and his surviving sons rose again, vowing to wage war from the darkness itself. Their homeworld, once known as Lycrus, would eventually be renamed Deliverance and became a symbol of their resilience. An airless moon orbiting the forged world of Kaidavar, Deliverance was no paradise, as its surface bore scars from endless labor. Its skies were blackened and silent. Yet it was here, in the hollowed and desolate places, that the Ravenspire was to be built, a fortress monastery of shadowed steel. Here, the Raven Guard would become known for their measured intellect and cold efficiency, as they would learn to strike not in anger, but in inevitability. Their tactics emphasize infiltration, precision, and sudden acts of violence. They prefer to end wars before the enemy can even realize that it has begun, and when close combat is inevitable and unavoidable, their assault marines descend like wraiths, lightning claws gleaming in the darkened shadows, ripping through the opposition with a surgical ferocity that few are known for. Amongst these shadowed warriors, few names are spoken with as much reverence and respect as Kayvan Shrike, once commander of the 3rd Company, later chapter master of the Raven Guard, before abdicating his role to someone he believed was his better. Aton Shan. Shrike was known as the Master of Shadows, and he carried Corax's legacy as being a man who leads not from behind walls or banners, but rather from the front lines, with silence entwined by steel and blood. The Raven Guard's bloodline traces directly to Corax himself, his pale skin as white as polished bone, his eyes as black as the starless void. But theirs is a legacy of loss as much as it is of triumph, as the Horus Heresy left them crippled, unable to shape the war's ending, and the wound of that betrayal never truly healed. For 10,000 years, the Raven Guard fought as silent guardians of the Imperium, haunting the battlefield and picking off mankind's enemies, ever watchful, ever patient, evermore. To this day, they remain what they had always been, shadows of deliverance, harbingers of the Emperor's will, and hunters who strike from the dark, seen only when it is far too late to avoid suffering such a terrible fate. There are few tragedies in Imperial history as haunting as that of the Raven Guard during the Horus Heresy. Masters of infiltration, deception, and sudden decisive warfare, they could unmake an enemy force with a single precise strike, just as their Primarch, Corvus Corax, had taught them. Yet even the most patient of hunter eventually becomes the prey, and when the Horus Heresy erupted, the Raven Guard were amongst the first to be called to enact the Emperor's vengeance. They, alongside the Iron Hands and Salamanders, formed the vanguard of Loyalist strike forces at Isstvan V, a mission that would become defined as the opening tragedy of a bloody civil war. The plan was supposed to be simple, a swift, coordinated assault upon the traitor legions to crush the rebellion before it could spread out of control. But what awaited them was not a battle, rather it was a trap. The first wave descended upon the blackened sands of Isfahan only to discover that the second wave, their supposed reinforcements, had already turned traitor. Betrayed by their brothers, the loyal legions were caught between a hammer and an anvil, and what would follow would be a slaughter on an unimaginable scale. Within hours, tens of thousands of Astartes lay broken and buried beneath the traitors' guns. When the dust settled, the Raven Guard, once proud and numerous, were reduced to only a scant handful of survivors. Those who escaped fled into the shadows, retreating to their homeworld of deliverance, and it was there, amidst the hallowed caverns of the Moon's Fortress Monastery, that Korax confronted an impossible choice. His legion was dying. His warriors, his sons, had been butchered. If the Raven Guard were to survive, something drastic was to be done. For solar days and nights, uncounted, Korax secluded himself in the highest chambers of the Raven Spire, surrounded by ancient sealed archives. These were the Emperor's own genetic records, tomes so sacred and so dangerous that none but the Primarch could unlock them. Within these forbidden texts, Korax found a method to restore his legion's strength, but at a terrible cost. An accelerated gene seed replication process, attempting to grow new Space Marines at a pace unseen since the earliest days of the Unification Wars. What was meant to be salvation, however, would be quickly twisted into horror. The warnings inscribed in those ancient texts proved to be true. The accelerated transformation produced abominations, creatures that were Astartes in form only, their limbs distended, their muscles grotesquely overgrown, and their minds shattered beyond reason. There are no official records of these experiments, but fragmentary accounts remain. They speak of monstrous figures, drooling and deranged, hardened into battle-ready, grim-faced custodians of the Raven Guard. Some say they were unleashed against Korax's enemies in a desperate act of vengeance. Others claim that Korax ordered them destroyed, unable to bear the sorry sight of what he had created in his haste. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the 19th Legion could only form a few successor chapters under the Codex Astartes. Amongst these were the Raptors, the Relievers, and the Black Guard, each bearing fragments of the Raven Guard's genetic legacy, perhaps traces of their legacy as well. But Korax himself was never the same. Racked with guilt from what he had done in the name of survival, the Raven Lord withdrew himself into further isolation. For a full standard year, he neither spoke nor emerged from his chambers within the Ravenspire. And when he finally did, those who saw him described a gaunt figure, pale, with a voice that was so heavy with remorse that it caused a sorrow to reverberate within their hearts. Without ceremony, he would depart deliverance, setting a course straight for the Eye of Terror. His final words, recorded by those who witnessed him leaving, were said as a quiet plead for forgiveness, nevermore. Korax vanished into the warp and was never seen from again. Some say he sought redemption. Others believe he went to atone in the only way he knew, by hunting the traitors where none else dared follow. Whatever the truth, the shadow of his choices still lingers. For the Raven Guard, it remains a lesson written in blood, that even light can cast a terrible shadow. In the records of the Imperium's history, few truths are more elusive than the Emperor's original vision for his creations. Across the Gulf of Millennia, scholars, archivists, and Imperial servants have speculated endlessly on whether each of the first founding legions was conceived with a purpose in mind, a role for the Emperor's grand design in humanity's domination over the stars. Evidence, though fragmentary, speaks with a striking consistency. The Imperial Fist served as the Emperor's unyielding Praetorians, stalwart guardians of his realm, bulwarks against rebellion. The Ultramarines seem to have been almost tailor-made to be resplendent, disciplined embodiments of the Emperor's ideal order of governance, his shining host of a civilization reborn. The Blood Angels seem to be a tempest of oblivion, sent to the worst war zone in order to carve out any resistance that would risk the continued existence of another legion. However, the 19th Legion, the legion that would one day bear the name of Raven Guard, fell for a far darker calling. They were his hidden hand, vengeful watchers in the dark, silent executioners of those who defied his truth. Long before they bore the Raven's sigil, the Proto-Legion drew its strength from techno-barbarians of old Earth, specifically from the fierce and cunning Zerk tribes of the Asitak Dustfield. These were warrior peoples who waged endless war against their neighbors and the sprawling Yosendic bloc. Their existence was defined by scarcity, survival, along with a mastery of ambush and precision. From them, the emperor forged a weapon of uncanny subtlety, soldiers whose patience and precision made them perfect predators in the unification wars. Even in the earliest days of the 19th Legion, they displayed a defining characteristic of cunning, brutality, or would it be more apt to say brutal cunning. They did not march to war under thunderous spectacles like other legions. They did not charge as a ravenous inferno, consuming all which was set upon them. Instead, they infiltrated unseen, observed without detection, and when the moment called for it, they struck with a brutality unmatched, using a scalpel to achieve what others could not do with a chainsaw. One moment, their prey would believe itself secure, and the next, the Emperor's justice was already at their throat. Records from this era describe the Legion's uncanny ability to transform absolute stillness to sudden, decisive violence. Their enemies would only realize the truth when it was far too late to react. The unseen blade already drawn, the gun already pressed to their temple. There was a brief, bloody, and utterly effective way of war. Armies, once numbering in the thousands, found themselves leaderless in the span of a heartbeat. Their commanders executed simultaneously in the dark by an unseen set of killers. To those who witnessed the 19th Legion at their work, even in their earliest days, their wars were not fought in the open. That was clear, but rather their enemies faced a series of vanishings, as their men would be gone without trace, their supply lines cut, and their command centers left silenced. In the aftermath, when the imperial banners rose above the ruins, there was seldom a witness left to tell how the victory was won. But these warriors were not wanton butchers. The emperor's emissaries often offered their foes a final mercy, a choice: kneel to the emperor or perish. Many bent the knee and were spared. Those who refused were erased with methodical precision, their defiance extinguished before it could take root. As the unification wars drew to their close, the 19th Legion's records of conquest remained largely unwritten, hidden even in triumph. Where others sought glory, they sought result. Their victories were silent, and their deeds buried beneath layers of imperial secrecy. Even amongst the ranks of the Astartes, few understood how many worlds had been brought into compliance by shadows alone. Yet the root of these methods ran deeper still, as the Serric tribes, from whom the Legion had been first drawn, carried with them a brutal philosophy that a defeated enemy must never be allowed to rise again. Watchfulness was not a virtue to them, but rather it was a key method of survival. Their ancient customs demanded that the conquered foes be observed with perpetual vigilance, and any hint of rebellion be met with a total and complete annihilation. When this doctrine merged with the Emperor's gene-forged designs, it created something both disciplined and dreadful. The 19th Legion did not merely fight wars, they ended them before they began. Their cold, calculated patience became their greatest weapons, as their silence heralded a form of doom. In time, this temperament would become not only a defining feature of their methods, but of their very souls. Long before the ravens bore their wings, the 19th Legion learned to live in the dark, becoming the Emperor's unseen watchers, harbingers of a quiet death. And though one day history would remember them as the Raven Guard, their earliest legacy remains shrouded in that same silence, a silence that has endured across 10,000 years, whispering of the Emperor's hidden hand and the ghosts of battles that no living man ever saw. Before the Raven Guard earned their reputation as masters of shadow and silence, their story began amidst the flames of Terra's unification wars. One of their earliest recorded campaigns involves the nascent 19th taking part in the brutal conquest of the Central Asiatic region, a land that had been ruled by a tyrant known as Tekalagan of Ursh. Surviving records from that era are scarce, but fragments paint a picture that is no less grim than the situation that currently occupies the 40th millennium. The 19th Legion fought not as conquerors in shining armor, but rather as ghosts meandering throughout the wastelands. They infiltrated enemy lines long before the first formal strike ever occurred, with small surgical detachments who embedded themselves across the region, unseen and unacknowledged, awaiting the Emperor's word to strike. When the order finally came, it was swift and absolute. The attack shattered Ursha's forces with a clinical ruthlessness that made the Legion differ from its cousins, as Khaglan's warlords were executed in mere moments, and the Legion's foes left broken to attempt to gather the remnants of once mighty army, which were to be driven into sprawling prison camps beneath the skies of Central Asia. Yet victory came at a terrible cost. Khaglan's armies wielded weapons forged not merely of steel and fire, but of mind. Psyker-wrought horrors were unleashed upon the Emperor's warriors, and it was the 19th that bore the brunt of this assault. Many who survived spoke no more of what they had seen. Some fell into a clinical despair as their minds fractured beyond repair, while others, burned out in self-terminating charges, embraced death with the same cold precision that once had defined their service. It was amongst these haunted survivors that the earliest of the Majoritas emerged, lone killers consumed by their own darkness, fighting as if every battle was their last. With Ursha destroyed, the Emperor's light moved onwards, and the 19th Legion, now blooded and honored, was assigned operations all across the Sol system. Their next task would mark them forever, as the battle would be fierce. This was the purging of the Xenos-held settlements of the Genovian range, with the moon of Lycia at their back. Of this campaign, even the Mechanicum's vaults and vast records yield little. What reports do exist speak of a complete victory, so utter and all-consuming that the alien threat was deemed truly annihilated, but at a cost that defied understanding. Every human colony on the world was found dead, and their settlements reduced to silence. Even amongst the Legion, the losses were catastrophic. Those who survived were equally recalled to the Emperor's gene forges. What they witnessed, or perhaps more likely what they became, remains one of the greatest unanswered questions of the Unification era. No similar withdrawal of legionaries ever occurred, even with the more divergent strains, such as the Space Wolves or the Blood Angels, or as they were known at the time, the Revenant Legion. In the later decades, survivors of the Lastian campaign bore a single haunting emblem on their armor, the ancient Jovian rune, crowned with a numerical 19, as a grim marker of their victory purchased in blood. By the closing years of the Great Crusade, that symbol could be seen upon the armored hulls of most of the Legion's dreadnoughts. Amongst them, Shade Captain Beholst, a hero of the Jovian range, mortally wounded in that long-forgotten war, was interned within the sarcophagus of a mighty Fubrins-class dreadnought, within which he would continue to serve for galactic decades, leading the Graven Guard into battle time and time again, until his final breath was drawn in the shattered defenses of Gate 42. He was a warrior entombed from a legion scarred, with a legacy written in silence. The shadows of the Unification War still echo and linger within the Raven Guard's very DNA. Whispers of what was won and what was lost in the Emperor's relentless march towards unity still reverberate throughout the Raven Guard and their successors to this day. In the twilight of the Unification Wars, as Terra's final tyrants fell beneath the Emperor's thunder, the 19th Legion was officially born, and christened as one of the last legions of the Legiones Astartes to take full shape. Forged in the fires of what is seen as genetic perfection, its warriors were drawn from the savage tribes of the Asiatic dustfields, men molded by desolation, bred for endurance and silence in war. Yet, unlike many of their other brother legions, the 19th would wait nearly for 2 full centuries before reuniting with their Primarch. By contrast, the 16th Legion, known as the Luna Wolves, found their gene sire rather early, Horus Lupercal, the man who was first discovered, at least by what open records state, and who was known as the first and favored son of the Emperor, would predate the Raven Guard's meeting with their own Primarch by centuries. It was not uncommon that the Luna Wolves and the Raven Guard fought side by side in the early conquests of Old Earth and within the Sol system. The synergy between these two legions seemed almost as if it were by design, and when Horus unleashed lightning assault, striking with a terrifying accuracy, the warriors of the 19th were already in place, unseen and unheralded, waiting to cut off escape routes and disrupt communication and logistical lines, ensuring that no foe ever survived or was able to mount a proper resistance. Those who tried to flee found themselves trapped by shadows, cornered, disarmed, and herded beneath the cold, dead eyes of the raven-blooded warriors, until their leaders bent the knee to the imperial truth. Members of the 19th did not speak much, but rather they would watch, judge, and when ordered, strike with a frightening self-control that unnerved many within Imperial command. Amongst rebels and tyrants alike, the name of the 19th Legion became synonymous with a quiet doom that would let them speak nevermore. When the Great Crusade began in earnest, Horus Lupercal often requested their presence, as he trusted the 19th implicitly, for they required neither glory nor recognition. In the words of one rememberer, they were ghosts of the Emperor's making, there before the command, and gone before the praise. World after world would be brought into compliance. Some resisted longer than others. Their governments dissolved under fire and blade. Others accepted the imperial creed with grace. For the latter, the 19th remained unseen, their blades sheathed before they were ever drawn. Such was their art, to strike without warning and to vanish without a trace. Over time, Horus came to regard the 19th as almost an extension of his own legion, a tool so efficient and so well integrated into his own tactics that it seemed purpose-built for his campaigns and his alone. His Luna Wolves swelled with recruits from the underworlds of Chthoniya, their discipline laced with the rough-edged culture of the gangs and loyalties of his own world. The 19th, however, remained few in number, reserved, insular, and distinctly Terran in spirit. They were not brothers to the Luna Wolves, but rather their shadow, an extension of his legion, in all but name. While the Luna Wolves deployed their own proud iconography, the 19th Legion retained their stark austerity. Their armor stayed gunmetal gray, and their heraldry was sparse and nearly unseen. Before battle, many amongst them painted their faces with the fine dust of their birthlands, burnt sands of the Xeric wastes, creating a ghostly visage that unnerved even their allies. The Luna Wolves, half in jest and half in respect, gave them titles such as the Pale Nomads, the Dusk-clad. Both titles spoke to their nature, wanderers of the wastelands, draped in silence and ash. But there were deeper, stronger, stranger traits as well. Under the influence of their gene seed, some legionaries grew pallid, as their skin turned near alabaster white beneath the unfiltered sun of conquered worlds. Others found their dark hair deepening to an almost reflective Vanta black, and in rare instances, too rare to be a coincidence, yet too frequent to ignore, their eyes darkened entirely, as not only their pupil, but their iris and their sclera became voids of onyx, deeply set within their pale faces. These mutations gave them a grim countenance, one that spoke of death long before a shot was fired. None could have foreseen it, but those features were the first signs of something greater, the nearing of the shadow of their lost Primarch, waiting just slightly beyond the stars. In time, those traits would come to define them completely. But for now, in the long wars of unification and conquest, the 19th Legion stood apart, cold, watchful, and ever patient. Always in the company of the wolves, but always moving in their shadow. Before they ever found their Primarch, the warriors of the 19th Legion had already fought for more than a century continuously of unending wars. In that time, they became something of a silent extension of the Luna Wolves. That we know, as they operated under the banner of Horus Lupercal. Their victories, though vital, were often hidden beneath the margins of official records. To the order of the remembrancers, their deeds were ghostly, their triumphs footnotes beneath the glories of others. Yet those unseen battles shaped the Imperium's earliest conquest, none more so than the grim campaign now remembered as the Battle of Hell's Anvil. Hell's Anvil was not a poetic name, it was a title given by the Imperial Strategos to a fortress so vast and unyielding that it seemed forged from the bones of the very planet itself. Located deep within the sunken metropoli of Bartigum, the fortress was a seat of the world masters, once humans who had long since been corrupted by centuries upon centuries of cybernetic augmentation and techno-slavery. The Imperial army struggled for nearly 5 years to bring the singular city into compliance, but each attempt ended in bloody ruin. Every approach swallowed by the labyrinthian depths of the planet's industrial waste. Tens of thousands already perished when the Emperor's command fell to the 19th Legion, as 3 full chapter detachments of the 19th arrived, under the command of Shade Lord Arkar's Fall, the master of the Legion. At his side came a contingent of Luna Wolves, warriors chosen by Horus Lupercal himself, sent to ensure the fortress would finally fall, and that at least in part, his name would be upon the victory. What followed would be a mark of both victory and infamy. Without hesitation, strike cruisers of the 19th Legion began orbital bombardment directly above Hell's Anvil and its subsurface bastions. The assault was merciless, as concussive storms of plasma and macro shells tore through the strata and rock, along with the steel that was used to reinforce these underground bunkers. The bombardment tectonic forces rattled the Barbatum to its molten heart, collapsing entire city blocks and reducing hab complexes to slag. Civilian casualties were deemed as acceptable losses, as the Emperor's will, after all, demanded compliance, not mercy. When the bombardment ceased, Thal ordered the assault to begin proper. But in a cold, calculated move, it was not the Space Marines who would strike first. Instead, he sent forward regiments of the Thorasian Voltigars, mortal soldiers of the Imperial Army, to lead the vanguard of the assault against the now shattered gateworks. Within minutes, the mortals were engulfed as hundreds of thousands of worker drones, the mindless, screaming remnants of the world's population, poured from the breach in an avalanche of flesh melded to steel. Cut off and dying by the thousands, the Thorasians' pleas for reinforcements echoed unanswered throughout the Vox channels. For hours they fought alone, creating a living wall of blood and desperation to hold back the ocean of cybernetic madness. And still the 19th did not move. Only when Hell's Anvil had been emptied of its defenders into the kingdom's ground did the Shade Lord give the order. The 19th Legion and their Luna Wolves allies descended, not in rescue, but as an execution force. Leading their way was headhunter companies of the Ashen Claw chapter, commanded by Shade Captain Kirin. As they cut their way into the fortress's hollow core, hacking through the last of the overseers and their machine slaves with a brutality that they'd grown oh so accustomed to displaying, it left hours of brutal tunnel fighting to go. As they reached the heart of the fortress, the chamber was now dominated by titanic plasma reactors whose power could have lit the continent perpetually. It was there that the Legion discovered the largest of the Barbatian overseers, a monstrous hybrid of both steel and flesh. Their battle was short yet devastating. When the beast finally fell, Kirian's warriors planted melta charges throughout the reactor's entire containment systems and withdrew in silence. Moments later, the charges detonated, reducing Hell's Anvil to molten ruin. On the surface, Shade Lord's Fall's forces had already cleansed the last of the worker drones. In the aftermath of this event, the resistance of Barbratium collapsed in its entirety. Despite the devastation, the envoys of the Mechanicum were quick to claim victory. Within months, the production facilities within the world resumed their work, as the planet's material veins once again would begin feeding humanity's forges, and those would be that of the nascent Imperium. Yet the cost was staggering, as the Thorasian Voltigazers had lost over 100,000 soldiers in less than a day. In comparison, the Space Marines of the 19th Legion and the Luna Wolves had only suffered a few hundred casualties, most of them amongst the Ashen Claws. To these strategos of the Great Crusade, it was a pragmatic exchange, a necessary sacrifice for victory. But amongst those who fought beside them, this was a darker lesson. When the 19th Legion joined a campaign, survival was not guaranteed, nor was it possible to actually rely on their aid. The legend of Hell's Anvil would echo for decades, staining the reputation of the 19th Legion in a way they could never wash away. Their methods, efficient, ruthless, unflinching, and calculatingly pragmatic, mirrored the merciless practices of their ancestors, where survival was not a guarantee for anyone who fought within their shadows. The legend of Hell's Anvil would indeed echo for decades, but that would come to an end when at last Corvus Corax was found and reunited with his sons. His presence alone would suppress the legacy that his sons had built up with quiet fury. The Raven Lord had no place for cruelty born of conquest. In the years that followed, such methods would fade into silence, forgotten both within and beyond the Legion. But the memory of Hell's Anvil remained as a shadowed chapter in the 19th Legion's history, whispered within the archives of the Imperial vaults, but never spoken aloud by those who survived it. Now, the story of Corvus Corax itself begins in both tragedy and secrecy. Like all of his brothers, as an infant he was torn from the Emperor's gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra by a combination of the ruinous powers and the literal worst mother in history, throwing her sons into literal space hell without a plan, allowing the gods of the warp to violate the wards placed upon the gene forges themselves, letting them in part seize the infant Primarchs and cast them away, including Korax, across the galaxy, who himself was flung through the void of the warp, leading to him eventually being discovered in the lightless chamber far beneath the surface of a barren moon known as Lycris. This was a desolate, airless satellite of an industrial planet known as Kyvar. At this time, Kyvar was a technological marvel, a forge world whose city-sized manufactura drew upon the mineral wealth of its moons through the ruthless labor of its enslaved populations. Lycris was in essence a lifeless rock with a thin crust and vast subterranean galaxies, and it might have remained forever unvisited were it not for a team of miners pursuing a newly discovered mineral seam. The timing of it was uncanny, as within solar minutes of Korax attaining consciousness, the miners themselves stumbled upon him. Some speculated that this was an intervention far less accidental than it would seem, hinting at powers unseen by mortal eyes guiding the events of the galaxy. The infant Primarch was taken in by the enslaved population of Lythris and hidden from the scrutiny of Kyvar's overseers. These slaves were no mere laborers, as many were criminals, political dissidents, or even workers who had failed their quotas. This was a population hardened by oppression and accustomed to brutality, possessing cunning born of survival. To them, Korax was a gift of fate, a child whose extraordinary presence spoke of the possibility for salvation, and they named him, in their tongue, Deliverer, anticipating the deeds that they believed he would one day enact. From the earliest days of his life, Korax matured at a supernatural pace. Though he was created with vast knowledge already imprinted in his mind, he required guidance to understand the subtleties of humanity, loyalty, and strategy. His mentors were those brave men and women who had survived the cruel regime of Kyvar, and they imparted onto him lessons in patience, observation, and cunning. They taught him the necessity of biding one's time, of striking only when the hour was right, and of using the gifts of his body and mind to plan far into the future. It was in these formative years that Korax discovered the full extent of his abilities. Moving in the shadows of his captors, he became unseen in ways that defied explanation. Even when in plain sight, he could will himself to be ignored, becoming a literal phantom amongst prisoners and overseers alike. Only the most advanced aspects or artificial detection systems could perceive him. But instead of the entirety of his being, they revealed a strange property, as the mind of their observer could be deceived and tricked into overlooking his presence when he willed it so. Yet he was still there and undisguised in any way, shape, or form. This uncanny skill would later define the tactics that his legion would bear. As Korax matured, the tyranny of Kyvar's tech guides drew to an inexorable close. Though the overseers remained oblivious until their doom was inevitable, Korax would lead a cadre of freedom fighters as he orchestrated a campaign of precision strikes where he sabotaged life and power systems alongside stealing mass amounts of weaponry, ambushing key patrols, and carefully manipulating the prison's chain of command. Each action was calculated, drawing the overseers ever closer to the moment of collapse. Then the day came when Korax would unleash the full might of his rebellion in a bloody, meticulously planned uprising. The prison population of Lycris rose against its oppressors. The fighting itself was merciless, with many prisoners having been hardened criminals, and the Primarch was even forced into direct combat, as he imposed a strict order which they followed to a letter. And he even went as far as to impose strict conditions that they would become free, as long as they could never repeat the acts that had got them imprisoned in the first place. By the end of the struggle, Lythris had been liberated, and the small moon had finally been freed from centuries of oppression. It was in the immediate aftermath of this victory, as atomic bombardments rained down upon Kyvar itself, that the Emperor arrived to reclaim his lost son. The convergence of events was near mythic. A Primarch nurtured in the shadows of slavery, a meticulously planned insurrection, and a father returned to claim a son who had already proven himself a savior. Korax's journey from captive to liberator, would shape not only the future of the 19th Legion, but the very methods and ideals that would define the Raven Guard and their successors in the wars to come. Unlike many of the chronicled reunions of the Great Crusade, the meeting between the Emperor and Corvus Corax was a singular incident in its intimacy. The Master of Mankind arrived alone upon Lycris and departed the following solar days in the same solitude. What was said during those long hours remains cloaked in uncertainty. Imperial historians have speculated endlessly, postulating that perhaps the Emperor spoke of the fragile nature of humanity, of the other Primarchs, yet unready to grasp the truths beyond mortal comprehension, or the insidious forces that simmer within the warp, shadows that would soon engulf the galaxy in flame. Some accounts suggest that Corax was forewarned in part of the betrayal that would soon come from the War Master, Horus. If so, he was careful to reveal that knowledge in only measured doses, passing it on to warriors when the moment demanded. One certainty emerges from every single record. The Emperor left Corax to complete his mission independently, entrusting him with both the liberation of Kadavar and the wisdom to govern his legion. This decision, some scholars claim, was deliberate, as the Emperor was ensuring that his son learned the harshest of lessons from war firsthand, absorbing the weight of command, strategy, and consequence without direct intervention. Corax's armament was improvisational, as it was culled from the hidden stockpiles the tech guilds had accumulated on Lycris throughout centuries, confident that no enslaved population would ever claim such devastating tools. Amongst these were atomic charges and mining munitions, weapons of mass destruction laying dormant beneath the enslaved moon's very surface. The Primarch, however, turned these tools of oppression into instruments of liberation. When Kadavar tech guilds launched a desperate counteroffensive against the numerically inferior freedom fighters, Corax made the terrible decision to unleash the atomic arsenal he had stockpiled. From his vantage point, he directed a precise bombardment across the manufactura cities of Kadavar, devastating the infrastructure that had long enslaved his people. Tens of thousands perished beneath the fires, yet Corax understood the calculus of survival. By destroying these centers of tyranny, countless of millions across the Imperium would be spared further suffering. It was a lesson the Emperor had intended him to learn, a lesson in the grim arithmetic of war that few but the Primarchs could ever fully comprehend. In the aftermath, the Cadaverian tech guilds capitulated, and Lycris received its freedom. Further still, in recognition of its deliverance, was renamed Deliverance by its grateful inhabitants. The planet's people had witnessed a profound demonstration that sometimes the innocent must endure catastrophe so that the greater good may be secured. This brutal insight would shape Corax's doctrine and temper the Raven Guard's ethos for millennia to come. With Lycris secured, the Mechanicum intervened in order to restore the ruined colony into a world that was productive in its youth. The Black Tower that had once overseen the oppression of the slaves stood, now transformed and renamed, into the Ravenspire, becoming the very fortress monastery of the newly christened Raven Guard Legion, a symbol of vengeance, liberation, and a calculated show of death that would define the Legion evermore. From that day forward, the Raven Guard not only bore the mark of their Primarch, but the lessons heavily learned through their combat in Deliverance, shaping the Legion that would walk unseen, strike swiftly, and act with cold, deliberate precision, learned under the fire, and forged with the weight of necessity bearing down upon them. By 922 M31, when the Raven Lord assumed official command of his legion, the Great Crusade was already more than a century in span. Corvus Corax then wasted no time in imposing the doctrines of Lycris upon the 19th Legion, blending lethal precision, stealth, rapid mobility, and calculated guile with the vigilance that the Raven Guard had known for millennia. It was during these early years under Corax's guidance that the Legion underwent profound cultural recalibration. The cold-blooded tendencies inherited from the Xeric tribes of old Earth, once the hallmark of the Legion, were ruthlessly excised and expunged. Many of the senior leadership and officers of the Legion, veterans of decades-long campaigns of oppression, occupation, and enforcement were reassigned to non-command positions. Amongst them was one Lord Akaris Fall, who had held the command of the 19th Legion and functioned as its Legion Master for 30 solar cycles. Corax's reforms were not merely administrative, but philosophical as well, redefining the Legion's ethos to reflect vigilance tempered with purpose, rather than cruelty born of habit. The Raven Guard's tactical acumen quickly reached unprecedented levels. Corax is recorded as having bested Reboot Guilliman in his brother Primarch's Regius Strategio Simulacrum, deploying unconventional troop types that Guilliman had never encountered before, including the precursors of the Moritas. Corax prevailed 3 times in these trials. However, it must be noted that once Guilliman adapted, the Raven Lord could never again triumph over him. This incident underscores both the ingenuity and the limits of the Legion, illustrating how Corax's unique upbringing had forged a commander capable of exploiting the unseen. Under Corax, the Raven Guard pioneered technological innovations that would define their style of warfare. The Forges of Mars would be commissioned with modifications to standard Thunderhawk gunships, producing the Shadowhawk, equipped with technologies designed to evade detection by all but the most sensitive of augurs. Equally remarkable was the Whisper Cutter, an open-air gravitic flyer capable of delivering 10 fully equipped legionaries deep into a combat zone in complete silence, a veritable testament to the Legion's emphasis on clandestine operations. These achievements were not of Martian design alone, as artificers of Kedavar, formerly bound to the planet's tech guilds, lent their expertise to the Raven Guard, creating systems and devices unknown to the mainstream Mechanicum. However, over time, the Legion's tech marines would be initiated into these secretive arts, thereby ensuring the Mechanicum would glean some amount of this information, and ensuring that the Raven Guard possessed the capabilities that were both unique and highly classified, allowing them to operate in a manner distinct to all other legions, with the potential exception of the Alpha Legion. Some go so far as to speculate that without Corax's patronage, these artificers might have been declared outcasts by the jealous lords of Mars, yet their loyalty to the Legion preserved their independence. Kedavar, having endured the Age of Strife, assumed a place within the Imperium that was higher than most other worlds directly under the Primarch's control. Its output, though modest, was comparable to a full Forge world, making it nonetheless vital. With the guidance of Mars's tech priests, Kedavar produced specialized weaponry and machinery for the Raven Guard exclusively, maintaining a greater degree of autonomy than most Mechanicum worlds could claim. It must also be noted that the planet's artificers jealously guarded their secrets, recognizing the authority of the Raven Guard above all others, causing no small amount of friction between them and the Mechanicum as a whole. Of all the Mechanicum's ancient subordinate domains, Kedavar maintained relations with only one other, Galphion 4. Though the precise terms of this relationship are mostly lost to history, the repeated presence of the Legio Gryphonic's Titan Crusade would leave indelible marks upon Titans alongside the Raven Guard in large-scale operations suggests a reciprocal accord, a pact that may still exist in some form, shrouded in no small amount of secrecy, much like almost everything else the Raven Guard has ever done. In this way, under Corax's command, the Raven Guard became a legion transformed, one that was precise, unrelentingly lethal, yet tempered by consciousness and the tactical lessons learned from Deliverance. Their shadowed path through the Great Crusade may have left them marked, but discovering their Primarch turned them into something more, something greater than they could have ever been without him. And throughout their history, though often overlooked, it was their silent hand that shaped countless victories in unseen battles across the void. The conquest of Carne Solitatus is one of these such victories. However, it is a darker episode within the history of the Raven Guard, a campaign whose full details had been long suppressed by the Officio Militaris. It is a story that shows both the brilliance and the ruthlessness that defined the Legion under Corvus Corax's control as the task force arrived in the Carian system with nearly 30,000 legionaries, supported by twice that number of Imperial Army soldiers. Their objective was the Thousand Moons of Carian, an immense series of void cities orbiting a planetless primary remains of an age-long past when mankind's reach had been far less complete. These cities were governed by isolationist rulers who had no inclination to bend the knee to the emperor. Here, Corax's tactical genius became a weapon manifest, rather than an assault throughout the entirety of the system, all at once, or engaging the combined massed fleet of Solemnity. In a drawn-out space engagement, the Raven Guard struck moon by moon, exploiting the isolation of each of these satellite cities. Every void city was formidable on its own, nigh impenetrable when together. However, their own independent strength proved a fatal vulnerability when severed from aid of its neighbors. This approach allowed the Legion to advance with precision, striking swiftly before any fully concise defense could be mounted, often before the enemy had even realized that they were under assault. The campaign, however, would take a horrific turn on Zenith 312, as the combined Imperial forces prepared a coordinated assault on the city's arch-controller, Agrith, who would unleash a weapon of ancient design, preserved in stasis since the Age of Strife, an animaphage of immense potency. The weapon transformed citizens and Imperial army soldiers alike into a mindless, frothing horde, bereft of all reason or memory, their numbers swelling into the tens of thousands, their strength magnified by lunacy. However, fortunately for Corax, the Raven Guard were relatively impervious to such an arcane plague, yet they were confronted with a dire choice. To allow the infected to live would have risked total chaos and further loss of life across the system, leading them to a cold, merciless choice. The 19th Legion would purge every last living thing within the Void City, cutting down friend and foe alike, granting victims the mercy of death. In the aftermath, it was discovered that the Arch-Comptroller Agrath had used the chaos to escape aboard his personal shuttle, leaving the city to burn and the survivors to perish. The Raven Lord, incensed by this tragedy, shifted the Legion's focus from conquest to vengeance. Mortat kill teams were deployed in order to hunt Agrath across the outer reaches of the Crane system, tracking him to a remote outpost drifting perilously closely to the star's corona. The Mortas executed their grim task, moving silently, methodically, leaving a trail of bodies piled up in their wake, erasing every chance of escape and ensuring that every path through the station was turned into a death corridor. They would make no effort to capture the Arch-Controller, as they systematically destroyed all the station's transport save one to prevent further flight. The sun's fiery embrace would eventually consume the outpost for over 4 hours, and Corax stood watch, listening to Angrath's final screams over an open Vox channel. The Arch-Controller raged, blistered, and finally pleaded for his life before being silenced by the molten collapse of his station. In this act, the Raven Guard extracted their vengeance and avenged the innocent citizens of Zenith 312. Yet this retribution came at a cost. The Imperial Army and Crusade fleet, deprived of the 19th Legion support in subsequent engagements, suffered uncountable heavy losses. What should have been a swift, methodical conquest of the Crane systems instead dragged on for almost a total of 7 solar months, with thousands upon thousands of more lives lost as the Legion pursued their single-minded justice. The Crane campaign thus became a testament to the duality of Corax's leadership, a brilliant, calculating, and inexorably lethal one, yet capable of imposing consequences that would reverberate on both sides, across entire fleets and systems. On the world of Fraternitas Maximus, the 19th Legion undertook a mission that would forever be recorded as a rite of annihilation. This would be the eradication of Bergshi, a highly dangerous, hostile xenospecies of insectoid design that evolved in isolation on the very planet Fraternus Maximus, as a detachment of Raven Guard operating alongside the Night Lords entered this creature's territory under the command of Sergeant Davrian Kaid. The infiltration team's objectives was simple: collapse the Bergshi hive and everything under it, thereby neutralizing its threat. Yet the mission quickly became a testament to the perils inherent in such operations, as the detachment was quickly discovered and all but Cade were slaughtered. Severely maimed and having lost one arm alongside both legs, Cade nonetheless succeeded in dragging himself across hostile territory, reaching Imperial lines through sheer determination and willpower. His endurance earned him the moniker the Carry-On, This title was bestowed by the observing Night Lords. The Raven Guard ensured he underwent extensive augmetic repairs, eventually selecting him for training as a tech marine on Mars in order to get him even greater prosthetics. This would have him set on a path that would make him a pivotal player in the later Schism of Mars. Nearly 50 standard years later, the Raven Guard turned their full attention to Indra Sui, discovered during their operations on the northern reaches of the galaxy. The campaign, undertaken almost 50 years after Corax had resumed command of the Legion, illustrates the melding of Deliverance-born insurgents and the brutal raiders of Terra's Asiatic dustfields into the doctrine of the now reforged Raven Guard. The planet itself, once a thriving explorator port of the Dark Age of technology, now lay in ruin, a veritable wasteland dominated by vast silver spires, many kilometers thick, its upper branches extending into orbit like skeletal tendrils. Within its monolithic structures, the remnants of the planet's population were held, twisted by centuries of oppression under Xenos horror known as the Crave. Corax, recalling the liberation of Deliverance, refused to countenance mass extermination, despite advice from his Terran-born captains to deploy nerve phage gas to simultaneously destroy both Xenos and enslaved humans. He devised a plan of precision, operating to save as many as possible while minimizing collateral loss. Less than 2,000 legionaries drawn from reconnaissance and infiltration companies were selected to execute this operation. The insertion was made at the Spire's midpoint via specially modified Shadowhawks and Darkwing gunship. This was a maneuver that required flawless coordination and absolute stealth. Within the Spire, the Raven Guard were confronted with the grim reality of centuries of suffering. Human survivors were malformed, packed into chambers in conditions more suitable for livestock than any sentient being. This was something that even the orcs might find appalling, as the Crave themselves were colossal corrupted beings, mutated by centuries of feeding on their captives, and augmented by foul warp glamours, rendering them nearly unstoppable in raw strength. The legionaries of Deliverance instinctively returned to their guerrilla doctrines, honed under Corax's tutelage, striking with precision, sowing confusion and isolating targets before delivering the final death nail. The hibernating Crave began to awaken at this moment, as the Raven Guard executed a tactical withdrawal, while Corax and a demi-company of Deliverance veterans provided a near-surgical rearguard. The remainder of the insertion team was deployed via teleport beacon rays, ensuring extraction of all forces before the annihilation was inevitable, but not prior to dealing sufficient damage. The battle's climax came when the arrival of the Deliverers, a company of Terran-born Raven Guard clad in Terminator armor, whose overwhelming firepower crushed the remaining Xenos resistance. Within hours, the Spire had been cleansed, and Indra Sui secured as a forward operating base for the Great Crusade's expansion into the Ghoul Stars. Yet even as this victory was assured, there would be grim consequences. Unknown to the Raven Guard, surviving humans were later commanded by the Imperium's iterators and other survivors to a life of servitude as tech servitors, due to being seen as irredeemably corrupted. The extent of this tragedy remained hidden from Corax, whose sense of justice and loyalty to innocence under his protection would likely have incited a campaign of vengeance and destabilized the Imperium's ever-expanding front lines. The world of Isvan III would be brought into compliance by the 27th Imperial Expeditionary Fleet, commanded by the Primarch Corvus Corax, some 15 standard years before the infamous Dropsite Massacre that would scar the Imperium during the Horus Heresy. This planet presented a unique challenge, as the Isvanians were a sophisticated and independent people, maintaining a largely cohesive industrialized society that endured intact through millennia of isolation. Scout vessels had confirmed that these humans had not only survived but flourished, making the Isvan system a strategic prize for the Imperium, rich in resources, population, and industrial capacity. Long-standing autotechnocratic culture prevailed on Isvan III, one steeped in local mysticism and entrenched in religious practice. When first contacted by the forerunners of the Great Crusade, the Isvanians initially demurred and eventually outright rejected compliance of imperial truth, demonstrating both pride and resilience. The Imperial War Council, recognizing the value of the system, issued Corax a directive, bringing the world into compliance, but without the use of overwhelming force, so to preserve the planet's infrastructure and population. The responsibility subsequently fell to Corax and the Raven Guard, whose legion were renowned for surgical precision, and the execution of this directive would necessitate low-casualty operations. Their black-hulled strike cruisers and gunships descended upon Isstvan III without warning, targeting the planet's military infrastructure and seizing control of the key seats of governance. Despite the technological might and superior prowess of the transhuman space marines, the indigenous forces, professional soldiers, and highly trained psychers known as war singers resisted fiercely. It was only in the Rad Death Valley, after carefully orchestrated engagements, that the last pockets of aggressive resistance were eliminated by the Raven Guard. In the aftermath, an Isstvan delegation formally surrendered to Primarch Corvus Corax, and a full complement of 19th Legion, around 800 companies, numbering 80,000 Marines, reinforced by the Theron cohorts and the battle titans of Legio Vindicatum and Legio Adamantus, were present upon the surrender. The Istvanians knelt before the sable-armored conquerors, defeated, yet recognized as fully human, and were quickly welcomed and integrated into the Imperium. Though they had fought bitterly amongst themselves and against the invaders, the Imperial truth prevailed, and the Istvanians swore to uphold its teachings by demonstrating wisdom and capacity for self-governance under the Imperial guidance. They were deemed as suitable partners for integration within the Imperium's broader planetary network. At this time, the Remembrancer Order had not been imposed on Space Marine legions by the Council of Terra. Nevertheless, a substantial civilian contingent remained and began integration upon Isstvan into the administrative, cultural, and religious frameworks demanded by the Imperium. Benedus Pal was appointed as the Imperial Planetary Governor for this task, as he was deemed as competent enough to enforce compliance, overseeing the dismantling of the entrenched religious structures, including the Chaos faith dedicated to the worship of Slaanesh that had seemingly been on the planet, and ensuring loyalty to the Imperium. The established capital of Kurbank, known in Imperial Gothic as the Coral City, was selected as the locus of Imperial power. Its sprawling proto-hive offered both strategic advantages and infrastructure to support governance and occupation. Unbeknownst to Corax and his Raven Guard at the time, this campaign was merely a prelude to the events 15 standard years in the future. The return to the Isstvan system, this time the world of Isstvan V, where the Primarch would confront the treachery of Horus and the shadow that would descend upon the Imperium. The Battle of Gate 42 would later stand as one of the greatest setbacks in the history of the 19th Legion, and a mere prelude to what would befall the Raven Guard on Isstvan V. This would occur only a few standard years prior to the Horus Heresy, in the wake of the triumph of Ulnar, when Horus Lupercal was elevated to the rank of War Master. In 000M31, the Raven Guard were recalled from operations along the chord edge of the Ghoul Stars. They were then ordered to take their place in line alongside several other legions under Horus's direct command, charged with retaking the Akum Sloth cluster. Though initially brought to compliance by the Luna Wolves in the early years of the Great Crusade, the cluster had rebelled in an unprecedented fashion. The population had succumbed to a mass form of psychosis, later determined to have been caused by Xeno's parasites. These parasitic entities matured within the eye sockets of their hosts, gradually taking rudimentary control and forming a collective alien gestalt focused on a cabal of primary hosts known as the Unseen Kings. Horus, unwilling to see these worlds slip from the Imperium's grasp, vowed an oath of moment to reclaim them, no matter the cost. His strategy relied on rapid strikes to eliminate the Unseen Kings, preserve the cluster's vital infrastructure, and to showcase the merit of his new rank to his brother Primarchs. The plan called for a combined assault of the massed might of 4 legions. The Luna Wolves, the Space Wolves, the Iron Warriors, and the Raven Guard were all to converge on the heavily fortified lair of the Unseen Kings before launching a final overwhelming assault. Corvus Corax, however, opposed the War Master's strategy, recognizing the needless loss of his warriors. He proposed a campaign of feints and diversionary strikes, drawing the defenders away from the main assault, so that the remaining legions could breach the walls with greater ease. This drew accusations from Peterabo, who denounced the Raven Lord's caution as a dereliction of duty, nearly culminating in a duel between two Primarchs. Only the intervention of Leman Russ prevented any bloodshed, as he urged Corax to temper his bitterness and channel it into fire necessary to achieve the objectives at Gate 42. As the battle commenced, Corax mustered the Raven Guard before the gate. Many were Terran-dominated companies, noted for their tenacity and willingness to bear the brunt of Horus's plan, and they would be assigned to the vanguard. Their assault was without mercy. The gate's defenders, empowered by the Xenos influence, unleashed devastating firepower with a greater precision than normal humans could manage. At the height of the engagement, the assault companies were decimated, and the attack began to falter. In a desperate act of leadership, Corvus led a forlorn hope, personally spearheading the breach. His battle cry ignited the courage of his legionaries, and the walls of Gate 42 fell. The Legion pressed through in a brutal advance, yet the ultimate honor of slaying the unsighted kings was claimed by Horus, who oversaw their execution. At that moment, the Xenos hold over the population dissipated, and the Akum Sos cluster was returned to Imperial control. The cost of this, however, was staggering. Countless of millions of hosts were crippled in mind and body, and thousands of Raven Guard, predominantly the Terran-born veterans who had fought alongside the Emperor and served under Horus for many a year, had perished beneath the shattered walls of the gate. The Legion itself was left severely depleted, reduced to a total of only 80,000 legionaries, making it the smallest of all the legions Astartes. Corax, embittered by this needless loss and the War Master's insistence, removed his legion from Horus's command, swearing to never serve alongside him again. In the aftermath of the deaths of the Terran line officers, many of whom had served under Horus before Corax's arrival, this schism would further. This meant that the War Master unintentionally removed any significant influence he ever had over the Raven Guard, which would cost him severely during the Horus heresy, as he could have potentially swayed many within the Legion to join his side over their Primarch. Some detractors later claimed that Corax, by assigning these Terran-born companies to the most perilous positions, sought to consolidate his own authority, shaping the Legion to follow his vision and his vision alone, safeguarding it from the insidious influences of the warrior lodges that would later sow rebellion within other legions. Thus, while the Battle of Gate 42 was technically a victory, it marked the beginning of a bitter legacy, and it was a testament to the ferocity and discipline of the 19th Legion, but also a somber prelude to the tragedy and betrayal that would occur on Isstvan V. Following this would be the Skull campaign, which unfolded over 2 standard years in a sector of space long claimed by the remnants of the shattered Eldari species. Beyond the immediate strategic goal of securing these worlds for the Imperium, the campaign would become a critical proving ground for the first 1,000 sets of prototype Space Marine armor crafted by the Mechanicum, armor that would later become immortalized as the Mark VI Corvus pattern armor, though at the time it carried the provisional designation of Mark V. Prior to the campaign, small numbers of this new armor had been trialed by the Iron Warriors and the Salamanders. Both legions expressed reservations regarding the armor's comparatively light plating, noting that it reduced protection against heavy assaults in contrast with the earlier marks. They pressed for a heavier design, prompting the Mechanicum to seek a large-scaled field trial before committing the armor to widespread deployment. The task of conducting said trial fell to the Raven Guard, whose numbers had been severely depleted following the bloody confrontations on Gate 42. At this time, speculation within the ranks of the Legions Astartes suggested darker motives. Certain Primarchs, primarily led by the thoughts of Peterabo of the Iron Warriors, may have intended to assign the understrength Raven Guard to hazardous missions in order to discredit the Mark V pattern. Some claim that it was meant to be the death nail to the design, ensuring that the heavier pattern would supplant it before it could prove its worth. If it was indeed the plan, it failed spectacularly. As in the verdant seed worlds of the Scaland sector, the Raven Guard displayed a level of mastery that surpassed all expectations, utilizing the advanced auto senses and enhanced agility of this new power armor in order to execute relentless series of strike and fade operations, hunting Eldari remnants across forest canopies, urban ruins, as their operations left the already weakened Eldari forces fractured, disoriented, and ultimately unable to mount a coordinated defense with their higher levels of technology. The campaign concluded with a complete expulsion of the Eldari from the sector, enabling the Imperium to claim the rich, strategically valuable worlds. In the aftermath, this mark of armor would not only be vindicated, but it would also become enhanced, as the Raven Guard's operational feedback and tactical suggestions were incorporated into the final product. In honor of the Legion's decisive role in the trials, the design was rechristened as the Corvus Pattern Power Armor, also colloquially beloved as the Beaky Armor. Production ramped up on Mars mere solar months before the outbreak of Horus's rebellion, and the armor was redesigned as the Mark VI Corvus Power Armor, integrating stopgap field modifications and repairs accumulated during the Heresy. Earlier sets were retrospectively reclassified as Mark V Heresy Power Armor, reflecting practical adaptations that the Legiones Astartes had made during this long campaign of slaughter and bloodshed. Thus, the Scalan campaign not only marked a military triumph for the Raven Guard, but it also cemented their legacy as trailblazers in technological warfare, ensuring that the 19th Legion's innovations would endure through the coming cataclysm of the Horus Heresy and beyond. Raven Guard, the downward spiral truly begins at the Dropsite Massacre of Isstvan V, which occurred around the inception of the Horus Heresy. And this stands as one of the most, if not the single most, catastrophic defeats in the entire history of the Adeptus Astartes existing, and also as one of the worst moments in history for the Raven Guard. What was intended to be a precision strike against the forces of Horus Lupercal, which the Emperor had understood had rebelled, swiftly devolved into a charnel house of betrayal, blood, and the near total annihilation of 3 loyalist legions. The chain of the events began in the aftermath of Horus's declaration as the Imperial Warmaster at the triumph of Ulnar. This was in essence a ceremonial elevation more than anything else, as it marked him as the Emperor's chosen, first amongst equals if you will, and placed him on a pedestal above his brother Primarchs. In response to the treachery that was revealed at Isstvan III, thanks to the flight of the Eisenstein, where the Warmaster had orchestrated a secret betrayal against the loyalist Astartes sons of the Sons of Horus, the Emperor's children, the World Eaters, and the Death Guard, the Emperor directed Rogeldorn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fist, to mobilize 7 loyalist legions to confront the traitor forces at Isstvan III. The operation would be divided into 2 waves under the supreme command of Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we have to understand who would comprise the first wave, and those would be the Raven Guard, the Iron Hands, and the Salamanders. The second wave was to include the Alpha Legion, the Night Lords, and the Iron Warriors, alongside a significant contingent of the Word Bearers under the command of Primarch Lorgar, who at this current day and age we know as one of the arch traitors, and the architect of much of the heresy. The Loyalists were unaware that the second wave would serve as a hammer, positioned to crush them against the anvil of the traitors they were intending to defeat. They were assembled to defeat. The Raven Guard would lead from their flagship in orbit, the Shadow of the Emperor, where they deployed alongside the Iron Hands and the Salamanders in order to secure the Orgal Depression. This was a strategically vital drop site, and their initial success did indeed come at a heavy cost, making them much more likely to believe that they had in fact succeeded, as the first wave's forces were significantly thinned, causing casualties to mount before Horus's trap could be fully revealed. As predicted, Horus would feign a retreat, causing Ferrus Manus to lose his head and leave his forces overextended and his veterans separated from the main force, as the man's hot head had caused him to forego the advice and even the pleading remark from both Corax and Vulcan. Manus was determined to strike decisively and express his anger at the betrayal of his favorite brother, leading him to advance directly onto a trap, unaware of the hidden legions of traitors awaiting behind the Loyalist forces. As the Loyalists would then fall back to regroup and to allow the second wave to advance, treachery would strike as the Alpha Legion, Night Lords, and the Iron Warriors alongside the Word Bearers revealed their true allegiances to Chaos and to Horus rather than the Emperor, flanking and decimating the retreating first wave. Amongst the most brutal assault was that of the Word Bearers against the Raven Guard, who were caught exposed and unprepared. It was sheer and utter chaos, which would cause Corax the Ravenlord to have to push back and carve his way through a litany of demon-possessed Galvorback, Lorgar's so-called Blessed Sons, and some of the most powerful possessed in all of history, who had achieved a near-flawless symbiosis with the demons who they had merged with. His movements were a complete and utter blur of charcoal black armor and gleaming lightless blades, midnight blades, as he ripped through the crimson-clad warriors with an efficiency only a Primarch could produce. Even when Lorgar was forced to enter the fray, he could nary match even a countenance of Corax's decades of battlefield experience, and the encounter would end with Lorgar impaled through the stomach and his back. This would have been a fatal wound, even for a Primarch, due to the sheer damage it had caused, had it not been for the surprise intervention of Conrad Kurz, one of the most pathetic of the Primarchs, the Lord of the Night Lords, who was even a match for a time against warriors such as Lionel Johnson, and inevitably, with both his manic fighting style and his gift of foresight, he injured Corax severely, who was forced to use his jump pack in order to escape, ascending into the skies as Kurz's laughter reverberated across the blood-soaked field. Meanwhile, the Loyalist command structure continued to suffer countless amounts of catastrophic losses. In orbit, the Shadow of the Emperor received fragmented distress signals. However, this very flagship was quickly overwhelmed by the Death Guard's legendary capital ship Terminus Est, which was under the direct command of First Captain Typhon. Within minutes, the Raven Guard's flagship and all its escorts were destroyed, leaving the embattled ground forces without any form of air support, granting the traitors near total air superiority. On the surface, the Iron Hands were annihilated almost to a man, veteran Morlock Terminators slain. Ferrus Manus, being the first Primarch to go down, was beheaded by his favored brother Fulgrim. The Raven Guard and the Salamanders, already decimated, were forced into attempting desperate breakout, as Thunderhawk and Stormbird gunship lifted survivors from the Urgal Depression, but far fewer would be able to escape than had landed. Corax himself was left gravely wounded, and due to being almost quite literally nuked, Vulcan's fate remained uncertain for a time. By the end, the first wave of loyalists was reduced to a pittance of its former strength. The Raven Guard, forced to retreat to Deliverance in bitter defeat, was made to lick its wounds, as the ranks had been shattered, and vengeance would now have to be deferred. However, what forces did remain were emboldened, as they would never let their thirst for revenge go. The Dropsite Massacre had left the Raven Guard, which was an already rather small legion, significantly underpowered, as they had gone from an initial strength of nearly 80,000 Astartes to a remaining fewer than 3,000 warriors. Much of this damage was actually caused by directed atomic artillery strikes upon the Primarch's general positions. However, the Raven Guard were not the most affected, as they still could operate in solace as having their Primarch alive. What didn't escape the planet was forced to deal with Mortarian's Death Guard and even Angron's World Eaters, being now supported by Imperator-class Titans. What didn't escape the planet would eventually be fully slain. However, it is important to note that in the immediate aftermath of his legion being utterly annihilated during the massacre, Corax had managed to rally what remaining warriors he had under his command, and had snuck around the traitorous Iron Warriors in specific, in order to attempt to sabotage their artillery barrages, and during the entire time he used his abilities to sneak about the traitor lines, attempting to collect anything he could from his fallen Gene Sons. Tragically, almost all the Gene Seed and or their bodies were destroyed and or rendered useless. That was until, after about 100 solar days, the Raven Guard were pushed back all the way into the windswept mountains of the salt plains around the Urgal Depression, and what lay ahead of them was nothing short of apocalyptic. Angron, who now had seemingly garnered some sense of sanity within his mires of rage, led his frothing white and blue blood-soaked warriors towards the mountain slopes and directly into the Raven Guard's defensive position. However, what truly saved them would come from an unlikely ally, as suddenly the skies burst open with plasma pulses from orbit directly into Angron's ranks, allowing what Corax had managed to gather to exit into the now open ramparts as reinforcements had arrived. This incident was orchestrated by Commander Barain, a Raven Guard captain who had been left in a defensive position upon their homeworld of Deliverance. Barain orchestrated the evacuation of the forces at Isfahan without guidance from Korax. However, this is not the surprising part, as behind the scenes, it seems that the shadowed hands of some of the most perplexing members of the Horus Heresy had been operating, as during the Dropsite Massacre, the Alpha Legion had infiltrated the Raven Guard, planting themselves as dead legionaries and following directives not from the traitors, but from the alien group known as the Cabal, as they now had ordered the pursuing World Leader's fleet to stand down. Their goal was not to aid in the downfall of the traitors, but rather follow a grander scheme that required the survival of the Raven Guard, just long enough for them to take possession of future Imperial assets, which the Alpha Legion infiltrators would later claim. Korax would never learn of Brain's independent actions and the disregard of his direct orders, or even the covert assistance that he would eventually receive. However, this is how the Raven Guard truly survived. Following their escape from Isfahan 5, Corvus Corax turned his attention to addressing the remnants of his now shattered legion, who were at the moment left with less than 3,000 Astartes. And while in the 40th millennium, this is a nearly unstoppable force against most threats, the scale of the heresy to come made this number unsustainable for any real scale engagements against his traitor kin, or even some of Xenos empires that still mucked about during this time. Korax would quickly and immediately reorganize his survivors into new more coherent, independently acting tactical formations, regrouping the majority of his infantry into talons under the command of Captain Apagito in order to serve as the primary tactical companies. The survivors of the assault platoons, however, alongside the dreadnought-interred veterans, would be consolidated into new Falcons, led by Aloni Tev, while the Legion's surviving bike squads, land speeder, and aircraft crews would be reassigned to new Hawks divisions commanded by Captain Solaro An. These designations were more than just labels, as they now worked within a new framework designed to operate the Legion into a leaner, faster, much more lethal, and independently functioning force, especially now that only 7 dedicated apothecaries had survived the Dropsite Massacre itself, necessitating new tactics along with new formations. This monumental shift was worsened still by the desperate need to preserve as much gene stock as possible due to the almost complete loss of all the gene seed of the fallen during the Dropsite Massacre. Regardless of this reorganization, Korax ordered his legion, or the majority of it, to return to Terra, with the primary goal to petition the Emperor for aid in the reconstruction of the Raven Guard. And despite the disagreement, along with the disapproval of Rogaldorn and Malcador the Sigillite, Korax succeeded in establishing psychic communication directly with the Emperor. At the time, the Master of Mankind had been fully consumed with countering the chaos incursions within the warp, while simultaneously attempting to stabilize whatever remnants of his Webway project that remained, which had been completely destabilized by Magnus the Red after his catastrophic shattering of the ward. Through this communication, the Emperor revealed certain truths that would reshape Korax's understanding of the galaxy, including but not limited to the Imperial project designed to control segments of the Webway, the nature of chaos, and the stark reality behind the outbreak of the Horus Heresy, along with the orchestrated campaign that the Emperor had been waging against the Gods of Chaos, along with the campaign that the Gods of Chaos had been orchestrating to overthrow the Emperor, utilizing Horus along with the traitors as their pawns. Yet this revelation would not be the only one. Astonishingly, the Emperor also disclosed that the Primarch project still had its original genetic assets secured, along with which included, but were not limited to, long dormant samples of the original undifferentiated Primarch gene stock and undiluted genetic material from all 20 Primarchs, even those who had been mutated due to their time in the warp. Now, this was not told to Korax out of the goodness of the Emperor's heart, but rather, the Emperor issued a singular command: this gene stock must never, under any conditions, fall into the wrong hands, ordering Korax, alongside his most loyal Raven Guard contingents, and some rather well-vetted Mechanicum specialists, all being guarded by the Custodes and Imperial Overseers, to go into the depths of the Himalayan mountains, penetrate the heavily guarded Emperor's gene seed laboratories, and secure into which they would proceed by securing the original gene stock and the associated technical schematics, allowing the Raven Guard to return triumphantly with samples of their own genetic blueprints to Deliverance in order to facilitate the reconstruction of the Legion, if not an improvement. In the weeks that would follow, Chief Apothecaries Six and Magos Generator Nixon Orlandus worked tirelessly in order to create a stable reservoir of gene seed from the undifferentiated Primarch DNA. This stock would be purer than any derived from conventional Raven Guard lines, as it originated before any genetic mutations or deviations had been made in order to create the 20 individual Primarch. This pristine gene seed would then be implanted into 500 aspirants, who would be further altered through an accelerated, extreme, rapid development schedule that would prove some rather remarkable results. These newly created Astartes, though lacking battlefield experience, were genetically and physically superior to the standard Raven Guard. In essence, they were proto-Primarchs. These recruits were designated as Raptors and entrusted to the command of Captain Brain, now appointed as the Master of Recruit, who had now been appointed to the rank of Master of Recruit. The Raptors themselves would face their initial baptism in a decisive strike against the Wordbearer's intelligence outpost, successfully eliminating the enemy presence and validating the Raven Guard's newly forged tactical structures. However, unfortunately for all involved, these leaner, swifter, and more lethal warriors, even under the oversight of Corax, were not without the touch of misery and misfortune, as the Alpha Legion had been rather patient and calculating. Their long-term plans, extending far beyond the immediate theaters of the Horus Heresy. While the Raven Guard celebrated this successful extraction and stabilization of the original Primarch gene stock, the Alpha Legion's operatives had deftly moved in the background, fomenting unrest amongst the tech guilds upon the orbital world Kadivar. There they subtly incited rebellions, assembling a hidden force in preparation for the culmination of one of their greatest schemes. Meanwhile, within the Raven Guard's own ranks, Alpha Legions had already inserted operatives into the loyal Astartes, into Corax's most loyal Astartes. These ancients, in collaboration with adepts of the Dark Mechanicum, succeeded in secretly contaminating the purified Primarch gene stock with a virus imbued with no small amount of demonic essence. The nature of this malign influence would remain hidden even from the Alpha Legion until long after the contamination had taken full effect, as their Dark Mechanicum allies had insisted that the virus could be extracted once the Primarch's DNA was under their control. The consequences of the virus being activated were immediately catastrophic, as the next cohort of 2,000 Raven Guard Astartes, grown from this tainted gene seed, manifested grotesque warp-related mutations, as even their minds were degenerated. The majority of them were rendered utterly unfit for standard service, and were forcibly confined to containment facilities. Yet Corax, demonstrating both no small amount of resolve and compassion, declared them as legitimate members of the Raven Guard, vowing, much like his brother Sanguinius, to one day find a way to reverse their afflictions. Of these recruits, barely 100 of them, if legends are to be believed, possessed stable enough genetics to function as true Space Marines, as almost the entirety of the batch could not manage to even hold a standard bolter, let alone engage in any form of combat. While the Legion struggled to adapt to these mutations, the Alpha Legion's broader plan would come to fruition. The rebellion on Kadavar unfolded in earnest, aided by the disguised Alpha Legion contingents bearing the insignia and armor of Raven Guard, meaning that of the original 3,000 Raven Guard that retreated back into the world, even less of them actually were Raven Guard. They maneuvered themselves as a diversion, this rebellion was maneuvered as a diversion in order for the Alpha Legion operatives who had embedded themselves deeper within the Raven Guard to steal the Primarch gene stock, and along with destroying the remaining Raven Guard gene seed, potentially crippling the Loyalist legions beyond recovery, necessitating them being liquidated. The operation only partly succeeded, as the original Primarch DNA and its associated records would be secured by Omegon, who had been covertly orchestrating the events on Kadavar personally efficiently from the very beginning. However, the destruction of the Raven Guard's remaining unsullied gene seed was fully thwarted. This was a final act and the last sign of noble duty from Chief Apothecary Vincenti VI, who had been directly entrusted to protect the gene stock of the Raven Guard, who had instructed the protection of the gene stock to the Raven Guard's new mutants, ensuring the survival of the Legion and their genetic legacy. In the aftermath, Corax was forced to make a difficult decision. The mutants who had retained combat efficiency would be forcibly integrated into the Raptor squads, contributing to a counter-offensive alongside small contingents of Imperial Fists and the reconstituted Therian cohort against a garrison of Emperor's children near the Kadavar system. These engagements in the end demonstrated that the Raven Guard's tactics, even in their diminished state, made them a formidable force to be reckoned with. But the cost was great, leading Corax to recognize the limits of his shortcuts and the folly of his failed attempt to rebuild the 19th Legion through this accelerated genetic implantation. Consequently, the Raven Guard would commit itself to the traditional recruitment and induction process more than any other legion, as they regarded the slow transformation of human aspirants into fully fledged Space Marines over many standard years as being the only way to prevent the loss of not only massive amounts of genetic stock and aspirants, but of being secretly manipulated by Chaos and their agents in their along with their agents in their The strategic cost of this approach was severe, as the Raven Guard's full operational might would be limited throughout the remainder of the heresy to a significant degree, along with the loss of all the Raptors, meaning that they would no longer be able to greatly affect the ongoing war. However, even within the shadow of loss and failure, the Raven Guard would endure, their minds and tactics sharpened further still by betrayal, and their future, though uncertain, anchored in the promise of eventual vengeance. The devastation that had occurred to them on Isfen 5 might have left them battered and diminished, alongside wary to trust, yet it did not extinguish the determination for them to fight within the Horus Heresy and to destroy the traitor legions. Despite them being stripped of manpower, in order to confront them in open battle, the Raven Guard's remnants would adapt into a new paradigm of guerrilla warfare, where they would not face traitors head-on, but rather becoming hunters in the shadows, striking at vulnerabilities, in particular supply lines and occupied worlds in their rear guard, all the while destroying strategic infrastructure well behind the front lines. Over the ensuing Terran years, the Raven Guard would hone themselves through this methodical campaign, as they would continue to ambush convoys, weapon shipments, and alongside adopting some strategies that would seem more in place with the Alpha Legion, including sabotaging weapon shipments rather than utterly destroying them, decimating human planetary garrisons, obfuscating orbital shipyards, and liberating forced labor camps, as they focused not on destroying the main fighting forces of the traitors, but rather diminishing the traitors' ability to ferry troops and supplies into the inevitable Siege of Terra. Each weapon cache destroyed meant one less shot directed at the defenders of the Imperial Palace. Each planet reclaimed eroded the enemy's industrial might. This became the Raven Guard's guiding principle. When direct confrontation was impossible, strike at the enemy's most vulnerable positions. Such an ethos allowed the Raven Guard to become so successful in this that it would be carried on far into the future. The next incident of galactic import that the Raven Guard directly took part in would be the Battle of Rivendell at around 006 M31, and this conflict illustrated their new combat doctrine in striking detail. In the wake of their return from Isfen 5, the Shattered Legion had regrouped upon deliverance, still reeling from the loss of tens of thousands of legionaries, as unbeknownst to them, furthermore of their ilk had been covertly replaced by the other masters of subterfuge of the 18 legions, the Alpha Legion. The Alpha Legion's patient machinations culminated in the aforementioned genetic catastrophe of the Raptors, but they were not only limited to that. They attempted to use the tech guilds of the world of Kadavar, the Forge World orbiting Deliverance, in order to strike at the Raven Guard itself, leading to the Battle of Rivendell. And despite being nearly undone from both within and without, the Raven Guard implemented the new tactics established by Corvus Corax, allowing them to strike at the shadows at the numerically greater foes, and assuring the smallest contingent of Raven Guard would be able to leave as large a lasting impact on the forces of chaos at any one time. However, on the other side of the galaxy, in the immediate aftermath of Isstvan V, there were indeed some remnants of loyalist Astartes scattered and broken, desperate enough to take matters into their own hands. This included some of the Raven Guard who had survived the initial inferno of betrayal and boarded the Sisyphum, a strike cruiser under the command of Iron Hand's captain Ulrich Brothan, who was determined to continue striking at the traitor legions despite the losses that the Shattered had suffered. Brothan and his crew, made up of Salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hands, painstakingly would secretly monitor the warp communications of their enemies, intercepting encrypted transmissions that hinted at traitor movements and grander objectives. Through careful decoding, the Loyalists learned that Fulgrim and Peterabo, commanding the Emperor's Children and Iron Warriors, were journeying into a warp rift later to be designated as the Eye of Terror. Their goal, at least to the belief of both Peterabo and the members of the Sisyphum, was to acquire a potent Eldar artifact known as the Angel Exterminatus. What Fulgrim made clear was a weapon which could potentially tip the scales of the Horus Heresy decisively in favor of the traitors. The loyalist survivors aboard the Sisyphum rallied a small fleet of like-minded space marines from the Shattered Legions amongst the Dropsite Massacre survivors and other Black Shields from parts unknown and legions undefined in order to pursue the traitor forces. Within the chaotic current of the malignant warp storm, the traitors would then arrive onto one of the Crone worlds. This was Lydris, a long-abandoned Eldar citadel placed upon the center of the world known as Amon Nigshik Keldius. Here, the traitors were met with the ancient Eldari defenses, which had been automated constructs animated by the souls of the planet's long-dead inhabitants. Each encounter had forced the traitors to expend men and munition against systems who had last been active tens of millennia ago. Yet the true horror lay deep beneath the surface. Fulgrim's quest for the Angel Exterminatus had been not but a calculated ruse, designed to exploit his brother Peterabo's ambition and the Iron Warrior's obedience to the Lord of Iron, since Fulgrim at that point was a champion, nay, the very champion of Slaanesh. It seems that he required the life force of another Primarch, alongside the unique energies of a site sacred to his patron's creators, in order to complete his ascension into demonhood without the risk of dying. He accomplished this by gifting Peterabo with a skull-shaped gift, which would be affixed to a cloak given to Peterabo. This pin housed the Magstar stone, which was designed to siphon the Iron Warrior Primarch's life energy and gift it to Fulgrim over the course of their incursion. And it was only when Peterabo discovered this deception that the Iron Warriors would turn their weapons against the Emperor's children, igniting a brutal three-way brouhaha between the loyalists from the Sisyphum who had chosen this moment, not earlier when the ascension of Fulgrim could have been prevented, in order to act. In the course of this brutal melee and carnage, there was no small amount of carnage, as Fulgrim was struck down by his brother Peterabo with Forgebreaker, a hammer originally forged for Ferris Manus. Ironically, this act was what was necessitated by the Slaaneshi ritual to fully transform Fulgrim's body into a vessel of Slaanesh's power, reshaping the Phoenician into a serpentine demon prince, becoming the first of the traitor Primarchs to truly ascend to immortality in such a manner. This led to the Emperor's Children's forces being teleported away from the now collapsing Crone world, which had been drained of its energies in Fulgrim's ascension. Peterabo and the Iron Warriors would then escape through the collapsing Eye of Terror themselves. This ensured that the potential slaying of at least one traitor Primarch did not occur by the members of the Shattered Legions within the Sisyphum. However, further down the line, the first decisive offensive after the massacre that the Raven Guard would take part in would be the raid on Cruxix, and it represented the Legion's return to active operations, where they had tested the mettle of the Raptors. Here they had been assigned to striking at the Wordbearer's listening posts. This operation was meant to assess both the discipline and the combat readiness of what was supposedly the genetically perfected warriors that now constituted the core of the Raven Guard's rebuilt Legion. This operation would last less than 20 minutes, and it would prove that the Raptors were able to obliterate the garrison due to their significantly higher physical stats, along with their vastly overwhelming precision and lethality. Following this raid, the first 300 of the Raptors were officially declared fully battle-ready, and after this, the Raven Guard's main fighting force was redirected into the siege on the fortress of Narcissus. This would be a series of engagements rather than a singular battle, where the Raven Guard would reclaim some of the honor that they had lost after being shattered. And it would occur in 007 M31, when the Raven Guard turned their attention to the world of Narcissus, the famed Perfect Fortress. This was a relic of the early Great Crusade era, built by the 3rd Legion, the Emperor's Children, and it was, in essence, as perfect of a military bastion as possible, designed as both a fortress and a hive city of extraordinary complexity. Within said complexity was the genius of its creation, as the elegant colonnades and administrative centers massed weapons depots, with every balcony designed as a firing lane and every terrace made to be transformed into a pre-planned killing zone for defensive staging. The fortress's name was no mere boast, but a testament to its formidable design, one that would test even the most seasoned warriors of the Raven Guard. For the severely diminished Legion, a direct assault was beyond their capacity, even with their new temporary fighting force, following the Caravan uprising and the loss of much, if not all, of their new aspirants. However, the Raven Guard were able to augment their forces with the implementation of combined squads of Raven Guard and Therion cohorts, regiments of the Imperial Guard army sworn to the Emperor's cause. These soldiers bore the brunt of the initial assault, landing quite a distance from the fortress itself and marching into devastating fire for 3 grueling days, and for said days they would advance under ruthless bombardment, only to be forced to retreat time and time again, their losses anticipated by Captain Lathyrus of the Emperor's Children. However, this was all within the Raven Guard's plans, as it left the Emperor's Children overextended and vulnerable. Seizing the opportunity, the Raven Guard emerged from their concealment, hidden in the urban depths of Narcissus. They struck with a calculated precision that beguiled their decreased forces, exploiting the disarray caused by the Therion's sacrificial engagement. Within a single day, this so-called perfect fortress fell, and while it wasn't a major victory where scores of traitor forces were slain, or even a major hub of munitions manufacture, it was a symbolic victory that struck back at the traitors' 3rd Legion, denoting the superiority of the 19th Legion as they returned to the front lines of combat, since this wasn't just an assault on a fortress, but a direct defiance against Horus and the Emperor's Children. As this was going on, the Raven Guard extended their operations further still to the liberation of the Sacrato, a planet enslaved early in the Horus heresy by the sons of Horus themselves. This world had been transformed into a massive worldwide prison where its population was subjected to oppression and brutality greater than even that in the worst worlds during the 41st millennium. However, despite this soul-crushing brutality, discreet resistance movements had gradually coalesced into a rebellion ready to strike. Upon the arrival of the Raven Guard, they were able to use these forces and provide surgical precision strikes to crucial positions, allowing the local population to swarm their enemies, destroying them with sheer numbers. Casualties would be regrettably high amongst the natives of the world, yet their combined efforts allowed for the planet's liberation and the destruction of a militarily superior force. To bolster morale and consolidate their forces, Corvus Corax went so far as to utilize the astropathic choir to broadcast the rallying cries of this world across all Imperial space. This message would draw in over 300 Astartes from various legions, which we are assured to would include loyalist members who had potentially survived from the traitor legions, who were all eager to learn of the Raven Guard's style of guerrilla warfare. Amongst these returning warriors included Gareth Aridi, the former commander of the Shadow Wardens and Corax's personal bodyguard. Long thought dead, Arindi arrived bringing intelligence on another prison world, Kandiru, which would also soon fall under the Raven Guard's assault. The Legion's next major operation was the range on Capel 5642A, and it once again exemplified the Raven Guard's preferred tactics in the heresy: precision strikes against strategic targets in order to maximize disruption with the use of minimal forces. This world was located in the Carthenian Reach. Rather than a traditional world, it was a Mechanicum-controlled asteroid base functioning as a shipyard, using forced labor. This world was used to accelerate traitorous warship production, completing years of construction through forced slave labor in a fraction of the usual time. The Raven Guard's assault cadres, delivered via Stormbirds, Thunderhawks, and other varied assault craft, neutralized the orbital defenses. Then, within minutes, legionaries penetrated the base, drawing the defenders' attention, while Avenger-class torpedo craft struck, allowing the docks and the completed ships to be obliterated within a single devastating blow. This was an attack executed so swiftly that the attackers had already withdrawn before the destruction had occurred proper, and those forces would be ambushed further still. In the year 007 M31, the Raven Guard turned their attention to a minor Mechanicum forge world known as Gunstax II, a planet made up of acidic seas and ever-shifting cloudscapes, where barge cities roamed the skies like islands upon a corrosive ocean. Amongst them was Atlas, a city which stood as both an industrial hub and a military outpost. Its ruler, Archmagos Delvier, had allied himself with the traitors, word-bearers, and begun production of unknown demon engines and machines of unspeakable corruption, whose purpose would soon be revealed, if allowed to fulfill Chaos's machinations. However, by what would be recorded as an act of fortunate timing, the Raven Guard came upon Kemel, a strike cruiser tasked with resupplying the traitorous legions, and leading this assault personally was Corvus Corax, accompanied by his senior officers. They would seize the vessel, and within the ship's data cores, the Raven Guard uncovered the ship's intended destination, and with it, the revelation of the word-bearer's machinations. This compelled Corax to divide his forces in order to investigate the world, all the while continuing their assaults as normal, as to not draw undue attention to this incident. On Constax II, the Raven Guard quickly observed the extent of Chaos's influence upon the city, including the titanic defenders of Legio Navialis, all which had fallen under the Archmagos' sway. Employing deception and precision strikes, the Legion seized control of Atlas, and they were even aided by loyalist Mechanicum elements who had been waiting for just the right time to strike, alongside the colossal might of Castor Terminus, a warlord-class titan, assigned to defend the world. With Atlas now secure, Corax ordered an assault on the capital itself, Laputus, where the word-bearers and the Dark Mechanicum awaited. As had become customary, Corax left the ground offensive to his commanders while he personally engaged in the fiercest fighting. Within the shrine of the machine god, he would encounter a new type of demon engine. These were machines of completely unrecorded design, who would later be more easily identified as derivatives of defilers. After neutralizing these threats, Corax pursued the Archmagos, who would quickly fall to the Primarchs' lightning claws. And this was before he even confronted the Word-Bearer's champion, Azor Narthakin. Narthakin, a former librarian now possessed by a demon, had opened a warp rift in order to siphon the energy of the world and sustain his nigh infinite regeneration. The battle reached a near catastrophic impasse, with the Primarch himself being imperiled. Corax would then bet it all on a decisive strike, hurling the possessed librarian into the warp rift he had opened, collapsing the portal and obliterating both the sorcerer and the blasphemous machinery therein, as they were in mid-transmit into the warp. This left the world to be liberated. Then, in 008 M31, the Raven Guard faced their next major challenge, what would become known as the Day of Vengeance on the prison world of Craindiu. This was an operation designed to inaugurate a new method of warfare, one designed primarily to destabilize traitor-held domains through coordinated civilian uprisings and precision Astartes strikes. Commander Shakou had infiltrated Karandu months prior, organizing resistance cells in order to prepare for a full-on revolt. At the appointed hour, designated as V-Day, the population rose against their oppressors, forcing enemy forces into reactive deployments. Elite Mordethian squads landed covertly in the capital, seizing plasma generators and overloading the city's power grid, plunging it into full onset darkness, crippling their anti-air defenses simultaneously. All the while, Raptor companies, under the command of Brain, targeted key installations, revealing Karandu to be more than just a prison. Instead, it was a laboratory of horrors and abominations uncountable. Under the direction of the Emperor's Children Chief Apothecary Fabius Bile, they had been capturing loyalist Astartes and subjecting them to gruesome experiments, all in order to produce a new class of warrior, one which he would continue to obsessively attempt to create, referred to as New Men, or rather, Legiones Superior. These enhanced soldiers, equipped with unknown technologies, were able to overwhelm Corax himself, capturing the Primarch in a moment of dire peril. Only the last-minute intervention by a Raven Guard task force led by Gareth Arandia, acting against orders, ignoring his Primarch outright, was able to save Corvus Corax and ensure the rebellion's success. At a later date, still within 008 M31, the Raven Guard light cruiser Fearless embarked on what was intended to be a routine sweep of an uncharted sector, an operation that would unexpectedly reveal the fragility of the order established in the wake of the Horus Heresy. In the void of an uninhabited system, the crew encountered a derelict Astartes rapid deployment vessel, drifting lifelessly and devoid of power. The vessel's origin was the 6th Legion, the Space Wolves. Curiously enough, the ship bore no visible signs of damage or even an engagement, yet inside, the boarding party discovered 3 defaced corpses which were unmistakably of Space Marine stature. Lieutenant Navarre Huff, commanding the Fearless and a company of what is assumed to be Raptors, ordered a systematic boarding action and investigation. The ship's logs were traced to originate in an uninhabited moon orbiting a gas giant in a nearby star system. Upon arrival, the Raven Guard discovered a Sons of Horus detachment laying siege to a loyalist facility. The defenders were revealed to be surviving Space Wolves. Recognizing this opportunity, the Raven Guard allied with the Space Wolves. Utilizing stealth and precision timing, the Fearless launched surgical strikes against enemy vessels, annihilating it immediately following an orbital bombardment upon trader positions. As the Sons of Horus stormed the Loyalist position seeking to reclaim their orbital defenses, they encountered a carefully laid out trap. The facility's plasma generators were rigged to overload. The detonation itself obliterated the assaulting forces, yet tragically none of the Space Wolves could evacuate in time, resulting in casualties that would haunt the entirety of the campaign's participants. Lieutenant Health consistently was recorded stating his deep remorse within personal logs. However, there are rumors which suggest potential discrepancies between the accounts and the actual events. To this day, the ultimate fate of Arvan Wonderweaver and his pack remains subject of speculation, as there are some who believe that the Raven Guard took this opportunity to bombard everyone at the same time, instead of risking their lives in order to save the Space Wolves. The Raven Guard's trials would continue in the years 010 through 012 M31, with the fate of the Sabius Libertus, a battle cruiser supposedly lost in the warp while fleeing the cataclysm of Isvan V, would be reassessed, due to after an intermittent period of time, the vessel finally re-entered real space, near Gauspar, the periphery of the Veiled region, within the southern galactic fringe. The crew itself, comprising of survivors from multiple Loyalist legions, had endured within extended stasis, awakening to a galaxy from which they were completely isolated. Complicating their return, Imperial patrol vessels, commanded by officers who were aligned with Horus, attacked the ship. In response, these members of the Shattered Legions mounted daring boarding actions in order to subdue their attackers and commandeering all the vessels they could. Over the subsequent 2 years, these survivors undertook what would be referred to as, in any other case, a grueling odyssey, constantly repairing their ships and engaging with traitor forces, ultimately returning to Subventum Solar and finally to Terra. There they would join the climactic void battles that were occurring during the closing stages of the Horus Heresy, demonstrating the Raven Guard's resilience even in isolation. However, the Raven Guard would not join the defense of Terra proper in any way, shape, or form, not only due to their decreased numbers, but also due to Horus's actions in isolating the world in a perpetual day, all due to him understanding that in the same day he would slay Sanguinius, he himself would also fall. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, and the climactic losses suffered by the Raven Guard at Isvan V, the Legion emerged, fractured, their numbers decimated, and the bloodline on the brink of functional collapse. During the second founding, when the surviving Loyalist Space Marine chapters were restructured into smaller, more manageable chapters in order to prevent any recurrence of a rebellion to the scale that had occurred with the heresy, the Raven Guard found themselves particularly in a diminished state. For several decades, the Raven Guard would labor under the shadow of its own past, recruiting new members and rebuilding from a near zero. This was a slow and painstaking process that shaped the former Legion, now Chapter's character. With insufficient manpower, limited heavy equipment, and a profound lack of armored support, the Raven Guard were forced to perfect the art of covert and guerrilla operations. Their tactics would now be forced to emphasize mobility, stealth, and precision strikes over brute force, relying on small, capable, independently operating units, capable of exploiting terrain and the element of surprise, along with intelligence gathering superiority. Even in the far-flung 41st millennium, the chapter reflects these conditions, as predators, land raiders, and even the latest patterns of heavy power armor are rarely seen amongst their ranks, mostly relying on the tried and true methods of warfare that led them through the heresy. Following the defeat of Horus, Primarch Corvus Corax accepted the second founding with no small amount of relief. Though divided, he recognized that Reboot Guilliman's vision for a far more resilient Imperium was a necessary sacrifice over the overwhelming power and the ability to expand that the old version of the Imperium carried with it. Yet for Corax, this was a feature he intended to face alone, consumed by guilt over the loss of 2 loyalist brothers and the damage the Raptor Project had caused to his legion, along with the measures undertaken by him to save the lives of his gene sons. He withdrew into an extreme seclusion within the Ravenspire upon deliverance. There, he personally granted the Emperor's peace to every surviving mutant produced by the Legion's accelerated gene seed program, regardless of how loyal they were. This he saw as a somber and necessary act, despite it being wholly unprecedented within the chapters. For 1 Terran year, Corax would remain in complete and total isolation, his anguish constantly unmitigated. However, eventually he would depart the Ravenspire, boarding a transport destined for the Eye of Terror, leaving behind a single word: nevermore. His ultimate fate remains largely unknown, a mystery that has lingered over the Raven Guard for centuries, shaping their ethos and haunting the memory of every leader, down to Kayvon Shrike. Centuries after his disappearance, the chapter would face another challenge: the deterioration of the Raven Guard's gene seed. Some historiators and gene adepts suggest that this is a consequence of the chapter's early accelerated development program prior to even that of the heresy, which placed an unprecedented strain upon the genetic templates of the Legion. Several organs unique to Space Marines no longer functioned as designed within the Raven Guard, and repeated attempts to compensate or to repair the damage has failed. Even amongst the Primarchs, this seems to be somewhat of an issue. The Raven Guard have been forced to increasingly rely on untouched gene stocks tithed and stored on Terra by the Adeptus Mechanicus during the early days of the second founding. This scarcity of valuable gene seed has necessitated extreme selectivity within their recruitment. Initiates spend a significantly longer amount of time within the 10th Company, training as scouts or Vanguard Marines for far longer than, any other chapter, ensuring that each new battle brother is as genetically stable and tactically capable as possible. Consequently, the Raven Guard rarely, if ever, engage in operations without a support cadre of aspirants, whose presence is designed to bolster the strategic depths and operational flexibility of the chapter as a whole, while giving further experience to said aspirants. Despite these constraints, the Raven Guard have refused to compromise their offensive tempo. Even when under strength, they continue to strike at the Imperium's foes, sometimes sustaining grievous casualties in campaigns that test the limits of their endurance and push their diminished numbers to the edge. While their preferred tactics are subtle and indirect, they are not adverse to fatal, full frontal assaults, employing every available ounce of Astartes' might at their disposal. Yet above all, the Raven Guard value tactical acumen, initiative, and precision over sheer numbers or brute strength. One of the more significant incidents that happened long after the heresy would occur on 508 M40, almost a century after their initial sightings of a rather notorious warband of Eldar pirates. The Raven Guards finally located their elusive quarry within the deeply frozen voids of the Sabaran Rift. They were well aware that any hint of an attack would send the raiders vanishing into the depths of the warp, which led the Raven Guard to deploy Strike Force Ultra, a strike team designed to be capable of overwhelming precision and swift exterminations, specifically trained to deal with such a raiding party. This group would be led by Captain Ordesis, who would exploit the cover of a drifting asteroid to bring the full might of his force undetected into the very heart of the Eldar's stronghold. And when the Raven Guard's Terminators stormed the base, the Eldar were caught utterly unprepared. The icy tunnels of this rift soon ran red with the vile blood of Xenos, leaving no survivor to tell the tale of this ambush. The next incident of galactic note that the Raven Guard took part in at a significant scale would be the Zephyr campaign, which occurred in 204 M41, 3 centuries after the Orc War led by warlord Arbuts the Incredible. This Wa had overrun almost the entirety of the Zephyr subsector and had encroached upon nearby Imperial frontiers. This led to the Imperium launching a long overdue crusade to reclaim any lost territory and push back the Marauders. This campaign was spearheaded by, ironically enough, the Marauders, the Eagle Warriors, the Relievers, and Raven Guard chapters, all supported by over more than 24 Imperial Guard regiments. This crusade sought to reclaim worlds forcibly abandoned to the feral orcs. After 2 grueling decades of campaign, the Zephyr subsector was declared purged of all Xenos corruption by 224 M41. The campaign extended further still into uncontrolled regions of space, where no Imperial hand had yet reached. One such planet was Bran, a savage death world of forests, steep plains, and jagged mountains, which was assigned to the 127th Death Corps of Krieg Regiment under General Himond von Paulus, and while clearing the open steppes proved rather manageable for the Death Corps, the forest remained dense and chock full of feral orc tribes who were particularly resistant to eradication. Von Paulus opted for containment rather than extermination at this point in time, constructing a network of fortresses that confined the orcs, which over time would evolve into Baran's first proper cities. These settlements gave rise to new Imperial Guard regiments, known as the Baran Siege Masters, whose expertise in siegecraft reflected the constant assaults they endured from the orcs. The Raven Guard established fortress monasteries on Kron, one of Bran's moons, in order to maintain a constant vigil over the world, stationing over 100 fully formed battle brothers who were tasked with constantly hunting the remnants of the orc warbands, not only on this world but on others. In particular, those who had stolen bits and pieces of Imperial technology during Arbuts' initial WOG. For generations, the chapter's detachment has balanced vigilance with selective engagements, cultivating potential aspirants from Baran's harsh and battle-hardened inhabitants. Then would come the Baran campaign itself, as decades after this, the Eldar of Beltan arrived on Bran, only to discover that the original Exodite colony who had lived here had been completely and utterly eradicated by the orcs, and later the remains of their civilization by the humans. Exarch Marion, the Fire Dragon, led an Eldar campaign of vengeance against the remaining feral orcs, driving them from the ancient forested sites. This displacement forced the orcs into conflicts with the human defenders, whose fortress cities came under relentless assault due to the now formed imbalance. Governor Asbara, now unable to deploy sufficient reinforcements in 224 M41, called upon the Raven Guard stationed on Kron. Shadow Captain Mordius, having assessed the situation, determined that conventional engagements would be insufficient, as he now would have to prioritize discovering the force behind the orcs' sudden withdrawal rather than confronting the nomadic greenskins directly. The Raven Guard advanced into the depths of Bran's forests, finding orc settlements completely destroyed, a devastation so advanced that it was not likely caused by inter-orc rivalry, meaning that something had disturbed the delicate balance of the world. Tracking the orcs across the Varan Voltus plains, the Raven Guard finally encountered the nomadic greenskins directly, but Mortis refrained from a direct engagement, instead shadowing the tribes in order to gather some form of intelligence. Days later, the scouts reported that the orcs were under assault. The Raven Guard rushed aboard 6 specially crafted Thunderhawk gunships designed to maximize stealth, only to find the orcs utterly annihilated. Their quarry then revealed itself, the Eldar of Baal 10, having orchestrated a planet-wide extermination, which would now start to target the human population. Mortis ordered an immediate strike, catching the Eldar off guard and inflicting severe casualties, including the destruction of uncountable scores of Eldar spirit stones. For hours, the Raven Guard engaged in a running battle across the plains, gradually overwhelming their foes through coordinated flanking attacks and numerical advantage. Yet the Eldar had anticipated such a move. As the Space Marines closed in on the remaining Eldar forces, webway gates erupted around a circle of standing stones, ancient monuments dating back to the Eldar's dominion over Bran. Through these gates, Eldar Swordwind reinforcements came, as veritable titans of war would now encircle the Raven Guard. Despite fierce resistance, this chapter's detachment was completely annihilated. Their last stand was brief yet heroic, and Bran was now reclaimed by the Eldar. However, the Raven Guard chapter proper has now vowed to retake the world and eliminate all Eldar responsible for such a loss, retaking Bran in their honor and punishing Baal-Tan for the atrocity they committed. Up next would be the downfall of Megararchy, occurring in 748 M41, when the High World of Thruskus publicly renounced the Imperial Creed. Due to the planet's ruling council, the Megarchy, a conclave of elders renowned for their eloquence and charisma, having held a strange, near-religious devotion to another ideal, were met with the deeds of the Raven Guard, who struck them down with a speed and precision which they were renowned for, executing the Megarchs atop their own spires, leading them like Christmas tree toppers. And as the Emperor's angels had struck down heretics, Thruskus was returned to religious obedience once more. Following this would come the Sabbat World Crusades and the liberation of Caligula, occurring in 750 M41 during the wider Sabbat World's Crusades, where the Raven Guard participated in a crucial landing on the chaos-held capital city of Nero, alongside Imperial Guard troops from the Latari Gundogs. They breached the upper levels and penetrated deep within the enemy's lines, inside the very Administratum Tower. Their swift intervention culminated in the unceremonious defeat of Demon Prince Voldorus, ending his reign of terror and restoring imperial control to the world. Combined efforts of the Raven Guard and their White Scars allies allowed the world to be freed of chaos corruption faster than expected, almost as if the Space Marine legions were designed from an onset to work together. Up next would be the hunt for Voldorus, occurring between 855 and 865 M41. When the White Scars' great Khan Kublai vowed vengeance against Krenex Voldorus, a demon prince who was now leading a splinter of the Alpha Legion and terrorizing much of the galaxy. Over a decade, the 51st master of the hunt, Khosrau Khan, tracked Voldorus across Zoran, Karel, and Modana, yet the demon prince repeatedly eluded capture. Eventually, their pursuit brought them to Quintus, a desolate southern rock which was once a bulwark against the orcs, now infiltrated and veritably infested by Alpha Legion forces posing as loyalist military units. Stealthily, Khosrau and his company deployed from an orbiting strike cruisers via Thunderhawk, moving through the planetary defenses to land in the blasted canyons of the southwest capital. There, unexpectedly, they encountered Captain Kayvon Shrike and the Raven Guard's 3rd Company. Years of strained relations between the White Scars and the Raven Guard gave way once more to necessity, and the two chapters combined their strengths. At dawn, Shrike led a strike against the orbital defense batteries west of Mancraft, holding it against overwhelming Alpha Legion reinforcements. While the Raven Guard fought steadily upon the ground, the White Scars launched a hidden assault from the southern caves, striking with overwhelming speed. The Baneblade Iron Soul, the last remaining war machine of the traitors, would eventually be destroyed, breaking the backbone of Valorius's forces. Within the city, the Raven Guard deployed across rooftops, while the White Scars tore through the streets on their bikes, striking the Alpha Legion from multiple angles. Eventually, only Voldrus and his bodyguards remained, cornered beneath the Cathedral of the Emperor's Wisdom. Despite the Demon Prince's formidable power, he was subdued as Shrike pinned him, while Cosero severed his head, ending the threat and allowing the world to be secured by a regiment of Talran Desert Raiders only a month after the last of the Alpha Legion's deaths, marking the official reconciliation between the Raven Guard and the White Scars, despite them being forced to work on campaigns prior. The next event of note might not be as groundbreaking, however, it occurred in 890 M41 when the Raven Guard faced the Word Bearers under Dark Apostle Erilik, who was attempting to resupply the Fortress of Damnation. The Word Bearers were caught off guard by Raven Guard scouts. Trapped and outgunned, the Chaos Forces would quickly be overwhelmed and obliterated under continuous concentrated fire from Storm Raven gunships, unable to escape in the merciless crossfire between the Storm Ravens and the Raven Guard scouts. Then would come the battle for Targaryen 8, when Shadow Captain Shrike and a detachment of infiltrators found themselves stranded behind Orc lines when their Thunderhawk was destroyed. For over 2 years, the team waged a guerrilla war, sabotaging Orc infrastructure, stealing munitions, and relaying intelligence to Imperial forces. Their actions accelerated the campaign's conclusion by decades, if not more so, earning Shrike the revered Imperial laurels, a testament to his enduring impact on the Imperium as a whole. Then would come the battle for Empoleon II. On the world of Empoleon II, the Raven Guard faced an Iron Warrior's fortress whose defenses appeared nigh insurmountable. Victory was only possible through the timely intervention of the Brazen Minotaurs, who sacrificed an entire company in order to divert the enemy. This allowed the Raven Guard's 4th Company to infiltrate their fortress, executing a precision decapitating strike, which destroyed the stronghold from within. Later still in M41 would come the mission to Kashrakt. During a prolonged conflict in the Sagaran Reach, the Brazen Minotaur's chief librarian, Thelson, fell into the hands of the Imperium's Blight, a corrupted Space Marine warband, and was transported to the mortuary world of Kalshut for interrogation and likely either destruction or forced conversion into a follower of one of the 4 Chaos Gods. A small force of Brazen Minotaurs mounted a desperate rescue mission, but this mission's success was far from guaranteed. However, timely intervention would come from the Raven Guard strike team led by Shadow Captain Corion, who deployed covertly to the planet's surface ahead of the Minotaur's arrival. With precision decapitating strikes, the Raven Guard cleared corridors and secured an approach, enabling the Brazen Minotaurs to use their greater numbers and brute force to extract their librarian. However, it must be noted that while both chapters sustained casualties, the mission was ultimately completed, forging a lasting link of honor between the 2 chapters. Then would come the battle for Train's world, as the Imperium Blight tightened its grip on Fortain's world, a critical fortress whose orbit threatened to spill into neighboring sectors, including the Kandor system. This was done through corruption rather than martial conquest, or even a display of spiritual conquest. This had allowed Nurgle's followers to seize the bastion, leading to the deployment of both the 3rd and the 5th companies of the Brazen Minotaurs, who would lay siege to this fortress, determined to prevent a galactic-scale contamination of a Nurglite blight. Yet the traitors unleashed relentless hordes of corrupted and tainted Imperial Guardsmen in order to delay the Loyalists, exploiting every weakness to stall their assault. This stalemate was then broken when the Raven Guard's 4th Company, under Captain Chiron, was deployed, as 3 strike squads were launched into the planet, and despite heavy losses, the Raven Guard were able to penetrate the fortress's interior, clearing corridors and opening a way for orbital bombardment, ensuring the devastation annihilated all Chaos forces while the Brazen Minotaurs held off the main force, saving the colonists of Kandor and turning the tide of battle. The coordination between the Raven Guard's infiltration and the Brazen Minotaur's siegecraft seems to be almost inbuilt by the Emperor's very design. Different legions who specialized in particular aspects of war, supporting each other with their own expertise. Then in 992 M41, the planet Nimbosa, which was on the volatile eastern fringe, became a recruiting ground during the Nimbrosa Crusade, and it was a land contested by both the Imperium and the Tau for decades. Multiple chapters, including the Imperial Fists, the Black Templars, and the Ultramarines, had attempted to assert final control of the world, with the planet reportedly constantly changing hands. Within this protracted struggle, the Raven Guard's 3rd Company, commanded by Kayvan Shrike, launched a decisive assault on the Tau's entrenched positions, compelling the Xenos to withdraw. And while the current status of Nimbrosa remains uncertain, operational highlights from the Raven Guard show that they could be overwhelmed, in particular with rapid surgical strikes against heavily fortified positions. Then would come an incident of a slightly more grandiose note. In 995 M41, on Lurid 9, the Watercast ambassador, Pormain Aureus, had seduced the local populace towards allegiance to the Tau Empire through a series of cunning, orchestrated, underhanded speeches. Guarded continuously by the Firecast Hunter Cadre, who were aided by Aircast pilots, the ambassador presented a formidable challenge. The Raven Guard, numbering barely in a dozen warriors, were tasked with eliminating him. Kayvan Shrike orchestrated a masterful strike utilizing a singular Stormwing squadron, bobbing, weaving, and barrel rolling the gunships through miles of graffiti-strewn underways, emerging from darkened coverlets less than a mile from the ambassador. The Raven Guard struck quickly and struck true. Mayrin Ores was slain mid-speech by the raw, overwhelming firepower from multiple missiles, bolters, and grenades breaching his shield generators. Attempts at retaliation by 3 squads of XV-8 crisis battlesuits were intercepted mid-air by Shrike and his jump pack Vanguard veterans, who descended with lightning claws flashing, cutting down the Tau's forces in a brutal engagement. This victory was both dramatic and swift, and all the while being broadcast inadvertently by the same pitch-fed servitors intended to amplify the ambassador's influence, returning Lurid 9 to Imperial control within hours. This operation not only showcased the tactical brilliance of Kayvan Shrike, but also the Raven Guard's ability to use precision strikes, psychological impact, and battlefield manipulation in order to countermand the Tau's strange ability to seduce humanity. Then would come the raid on Crestal Nervrum between the years 992 and 996 M41. The Crostal Nervum sector became a focal point of devastation when Wog Grahok swept through the area in 952 M41, transforming the sector capital and the surrounding worlds into a sprawling industrial base for Orc war machinery. By 988 M41, the Orc horde struck at Fasar, the sector's primary world, consolidating their hold and threatening Imperial control over the region. In 992 M41, the Raven Guard deployed to assist the beleaguered Imperial defenders, launching surgical strikes against the Orcs' production centers. Commanded by Shadow Captain Corvidae, the task force included elements from the 1st, 5th, and 8th companies alongside with a detachment from the 10th Company. The 10th Company alone contributed 7 full scout squads, representing a substantial portion of the chapter's recruitment pool. The raid had 2 principal objectives: the elimination of Big Mech Buzzgob, the Wog Chief's Megpoi, and the destruction of the sector's fuel depots and the refinery complex as a whole. Captain Erideth led a deep strike assault upon the refinery itself, encountering only light resistance as melta charges were deployed, obliterating the complex entirely and crippling the Orcs' production capabilities. Extraction by Thunderhawk swiftly followed, but the mission was now far from over. Intelligence reported a massive Orc column advancing on the Elysian positions. The 181st Elysian drop troops were tasked with destroying a partially completed Gargant but they were ill-prepared to resist such overwhelming odds. Corvidae immediately launched a counterassault, engaging Goth clan orcs as quickly as he could. The Raven Guard's intervention stalled the orcs, allowing the Elysians to regroup and evacuate. Yet their reprieve was brief, if anything at all. The orcs returned with Stompas, Death Dreads, Killicans, Mega Dreads. Corvidae's Land Raider Prometheus was quickly destroyed, though the Shadow Captain survived, dragging himself from the wreckage so he could continue to fight. With losses mounting and the tides of battle turning decisively against them, Corvidae ordered a full withdrawal. Thunderhawks braved the orc fire in order to extract the embattled forces. The cost was severe, as over 70 Raven Guard battle brothers perished upon the field. And of the 2,400 Elysian drop troops, fewer than 400 survived, and more than 130 aircraft were abandoned to the orcs. Despite these sacrifices, the orcs' advance could not be fully halted. By 996 M41, the sector's capital, Forsar, fell, leaving Deliverance, the Raven Guard's homeworld, directly threatened. In response, the chapter's Master of Shadows recalled all forces to the Ravenspire, and Shadow Captain Corvidae was subsequently assigned to serve for 2 years in the Death Watch as penance for the operation's outcome. Then would come the 13th Black Crusade and the reclamation of Cathor. In 999 M41, during the 13th Black Crusade, the Imperial Shrine World of Cathor fell to the forces of the Curse of Unbelief, an affront that demanded immediate attention. The Raven Guard 5th Company, under Captain Corvain Valar and Cordicier Zrain Kale, deployed aboard the strike cruiser known as Second Shadow, linking up with a vanguard of reclamation forces about to assault the capital. Cathor had originally been brought into Imperial compliance during the Great Crusade, and its loss represented not only a strategic setback, but a symbolic insult to the Raven Guard. The very battle for the planet was ferocious. All 50 members of the 5th Company were present, including Captain Corvain and Zeral Kale. Unfortunately, they would eventually be presumed as lost, seeing as the Second Shadow was destroyed in orbit. Yet the operation inflicted severe damages to the forces of chaos. Typhus, Herald of Nurgle, suffered severe damage to his battleship, the legendary Terminus Est, and more than 100 original Death Guard Plague Marines and a venerated Chaos Dreadnought were all destroyed. The 88th Cadian Shock Troopers regiments coordinated with the Raven Guard in order to achieve such miraculous results. And while the long-term strategic effect of this battle remains uncertain, in particular with regards to the 13th Black Crusade, the operation demonstrated the Raven Guard's ability to bite their thumb at their enemy, inflicting maximum losses despite being on the back foot. Then, in 999 M41, the legendary Battle for Ultramar would occur. The defense of Ultramar during the final stages of the 41st millennium represent one of the most desperate and internecine campaigns faced by the Imperium in recent memory. Though the Ultramarines were unquestionably at the forefront of this defense against the forces of the arch-enemy, they were far from alone. Amongst their most critical reinforcements was Shadow Captain Aetion Shan, leading a full squad of the Raven Guard's most elite warriors, dispatched with the singular objective of recovering the renegade Captain Ardiak Vans. Operating alongside the Ultramarines' 4th Company, Captain Shan's forces demonstrated a tactical brilliance while under fire that impressed even the leadership of the renowned Ultramarines. Their most remarkable action was the destruction of the Black Basilica, a colossal mobile fortress and demon shrine of the arch-enemy, capable of annihilating entire Imperial formations with munitions and war engines. Shan and his warriors infiltrated deep behind enemy lines, bypassing the extensive siege fortifications and scaling the sides of this very fortress. Inside, they planted demolition charges in the primary munitions magazine of the Basilica before attempting extraction. With no viable escape route, the charges themselves would be detonated within the Basilica, obliterating the structure in its entirety, shattering the enemy's offensive capabilities, and creating a critical distraction that allowed the rest of the Imperial forces to regroup. Following this act, the Raven Guard joined Captain Ventress and a specialized strike force deep within the core of Calth. Within this ancient, long-forgotten shrine, the combined forces of the Ultramarines and the Raven Guard faced the Blade Dancers of Zemogia and the Iron Warriors under the command of the legendary Warsmith Hansu, whose machinations had orchestrated this entire invasion. Every member of Shran's contingent, 10 warriors in total, fell during this ferocious fighting. Despite this, the mission succeeded, if anything, largely due to the Ultramarines being so heavily aided by the Raven Guard, leading to the Chaos plot being thwarted, and Ardrek Venas redeeming himself through valorous melee combat. Captain Shan would continue operations alongside the Ultramarines during a jump pack drop on Talsar, aiding Chapter Master Marnius Calgar and participating in the decisive defeat of Demon Lord Makar, the Thrice Born. Following the campaign, Shan attended to the solemn funerals for the Ultramarines and Raven Guard who fell in the defense of Ultramar, overseeing the recovery of the Gene Seed, including that of Brands, for return to the Raven Guard. In a rather unusual turn of events, during the Era Indominus, former Shadow Captain and Chapter Master Kayvon Shrike decided that his role as Chapter Master needed to be passed down, primarily due to Shrike believing himself unsuccessful due to the necessity of the fragmentation of the chapter's strength under his guidance. So, only recently has he elevated Aton Shan to the position of Chapter Master, a man who is said to be able to reach any prey no matter how secure it is, a man whose own methodology of war much more closely follows that of the Raven Guard's Primarch. This has led to Kayvon Shrike being one of the few Chapter Masters ever to rejoin as a Shadow Captain. However, it must be noted that Shan has decided to give a significantly higher amount of autonomy to Shadow Captains, trusting them to wage campaigns of misdirection, assassination, subterfuge, and terror in order to leave the enemies of the Raven Guard off balance and prime for destruction by the main body of the chapter. He has also dedicated the Raven Guard into forming new and more vigorous networks of spies, information thralls, and other agents in order to keep appraised of the ongoings within the Imperium. This elevation to Chapter Master only came as Kayvon Shrike had ordered the scattering of the chapter's primary strike forces, and it was due to Shan's ability and mastership of all three paths of the shadow that he was elevated to such a role. Despite some initial friction within the chapter, Shan has proven himself more than well suited for the role of Chapter Master, as he has allowed Shrike to return to the Greater Crusades, in particular, allowing Shrike to join the Indominus Crusade. Unlike Shrike, Shan is more of a backline leader, as he now only rarely commits his blade to herald the doom for the enemy, arriving only at the culmination of his battle brother's clandestine efforts, descending to land the final killing blow on an already weakened foe, keeping enemy forces from being able to gather too much information on his leadership, allowing the Raven Guard to maintain the element of surprise and misdirection at all times. The campaigns of the Raven Guard in this new era Indomitus, after the reinforcements from the Primarchs Space Marine, have revealed a chapter that has been honed by constant warfare and become masterfully disciplined in strategy and making the most out of the fewest amount of forces expended, embodying the very principles of their old chapter's founding. When shadows fall across a galaxy, it is in their concealment that the Emperor's will is most powerfully executed.